The general slammed his fist on the table and cut the radio feed, just like that. 12 men bleeding in a canyon, and he turned the dial to silence. "They're already dead," he said. "I won't waste aircraft on a corpse run." 12 elite SEALs, abandoned, written off by the very command that sent them in. But somewhere on the tarmac at Nellis, a woman in a flight suit heard that silence and decided it was the most unacceptable sound she'd ever heard in her life. Before we go any further, if stories about courage, defiance, and the ones who refuse to leave anyone behind move something in, you subscribe to this channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The last transmission came in at 21:47. Not a distress call, not a plea, just 3 words spoken in the flat, exhausted voice of a man who had already done the math and didn't like the answer. "We are compromised." Chief Petty Officer Nolan Briggs had been in tight spots before. Fallujah in 2005, the Korangal Valley, that nightmare outside Mosul where they lost 2 men in 40 seconds and somehow still completed the mission. He knew what it felt like when a situation went sideways. He knew the difference between bad and catastrophic. This was catastrophic. Ashford Canyon stretched roughly 14 miles through the eastern Nevada high desert, a narrow slash of rock and shadow that the locals called the Throat because of how it choked down to almost nothing at the midpoint walls closing in the sky, shrinking to a thin ribbon of stars overhead. In daylight, it was treacherous. At night in October, with temperatures dropping and wind screaming down from the ridgelines, it was something else entirely. It was a killing ground. Bravo 7 had inserted 3 hours earlier on what command had classified as a Tier 1 reconnaissance mission, 12 men tasked with confirming the location of a high-value target believed to be moving through the canyon system toward the Utah border. The intelligence was solid, they'd been told. The window was tight. Get in, confirm, get out. No contact expected. The word expected had always bothered Nolan Briggs. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders with hands that looked like they'd been built for breaking things. 15 years in the teams had given him a face that wasn't exactly hard, but wasn't soft either. It was the face of a man who had learned to process pain quickly and keep moving. His hair was dark, shot through with gray at the temples now, and his eyes were the particular shade of brown that looked almost black in low light. Right now, crouched behind a granite outcropping, with rounds sparking off the rock 6 inches from his left ear, those eyes were doing rapid calculations. He had 11 men behind him. One of them, Petty Officer 2nd Class Danny Reyes, 24 years old, married 8 months wife, currently 7 months pregnant, was on the ground with a through and through in his right thigh that had nicked something important. Petty Officer 1st Class Marcus Webb had his hands pressed hard against the wound, and even from 10 feet away, Nolan could see the dark spread of blood soaking through Webb's fingers. "Pressure's not holding," Webb called out, his voice tight but controlled. "He needs a tourniquet higher up and an IV line, Chief." "I got maybe 10 minutes before this becomes a whole different conversation." "Copy that," Nolan said. He keyed his radio. "Bravo 7 actual to Overlord requesting immediate CAS and extraction. We have 1 urgent surgical, 11 personnel. 2 confirmed enemy positions at grid." He gave the grid. He gave it clean and precise, the way they trained him, the way he'd done it a dozen times in combat. The radio crackled. Silence. Then a voice, not the TOC watch officer he'd been speaking with for the last 3 hours, but someone higher. Someone who had the particular quality of authority that came with rank and distance from the actual fighting. "Bravo 7, this is Overlord 6. Be advised, weather system is moving in faster than projected. All aircraft are currently restricted from the operational area. Extraction is not possible at this time." Nolan pressed the radio to his ear so hard he could feel his pulse in his jaw. "Overlord 6, I need you to say that again. Extraction is not possible." A pause. "Continue to evade. We will reassess when weather permits." Continue to evade, with 1 man bleeding out in a 2-sided ambush closing in and no ammunition resupply and 14 miles of canyon between them and any kind of friendly territory. Continue to evade. Nolan lowered the radio. He looked at the 11 men watching him. He looked at Danny Reyes, who was awake and white-faced and trying to hold his own intestinal fortitude together with both hands while Marcus worked over his leg. "Chief?" It was Senior Chief Eduardo Eddie Galvez who spoke the team's second in command, a lean, sun-darkened man from Laredo, with a quiet voice and absolutely no give in him. He'd been with Nolan for 6 years. They'd buried friends together. They'd stood at caskets together and then gotten up the next morning and gone back out because that was the job. What are we looking at? Nolan met his eyes. Command says extraction is impossible. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. He watched them hit, watched the ripple go through every man behind cover, the subtle tightening around the eyes, the slight adjustment of grip on weapons, the recalculation happening in real time behind every face. Impossible, Eddie repeated, and his voice was perfectly level. That's an interesting word choice. Yeah. How long before Reyes goes into shock? Webb says 10 minutes, maybe less. A burst of fire from the eastern ridgeline, 3 rounds high caliber, snapping through the air above their heads with that distinctive crack that meant someone up there had optics and was adjusting. Getting their range dialed in, taking their time because they could afford to. They're not rushing us, said Petty Officer Second Class Tomas Keller, who was stationed at the western corner of the outcropping, watching the opposite ridgeline through his N-odds. He was 27, the youngest operator on the team besides Reyes, and he had a habit of stating obvious things very calmly that somehow made them less terrible and more manageable. They're hurting us. Toward the canyon neck, Eddie confirmed. He didn't need to elaborate. Everyone on the team knew the terrain. The throat, the narrow point where the canyon walls closed to 30 feet across, was approximately 2 miles south of their current position. If they were forced to move that way, they'd be funneled into a choke point that even a moderate force could hold against an army. So we don't go south, said Petty Officer First Class James Jimmy Carver, who was 6'4" and had played linebacker at Penn State before deciding that football didn't have enough actual violence. He was currently reloading his SCAR with one of his last 2 remaining magazines. He held it up so Nolan could see it. His meaning was clear. How's everyone on ammo? Nolan asked. The answers came back in short, precise statements. 2 magazines. 1 magazine, 1.5, 3 mags. Webb wasn't answering because Webb had both hands on the Danny Reyes. The total picture was somewhere between grim and terminal. Right, Nolan said. He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. He was a man who allowed himself limited time for the emotional side of any situation before shifting to the operational side, and 3 seconds was his number. Here's what we know. We have 1 urgent surgical who cannot be moved without serious risk of fatal blood loss. We have a 2-sided ambush that is tightening, not static. We have insufficient ammunition for a sustained firefight. We have no air support and no extraction. Outstanding, said Jimmy Carver, completely deadpan. Nobody laughed. But 3 men almost did, and sometimes almost laughing in a situation like that was the only thing that kept you from doing the math too carefully. So what do we do? Chief Keller asked. Nolan looked at the radio in his hand. He thought about the voice on the other end. That calm, distant, bureaucratic voice that had said extraction is not possible the way you might say the conference room is already booked. He thought about Danny Reyes, who was going to become a father in 2 months and who was currently bleeding into the Nevada desert because someone at a base somewhere had made decisions that brought them here. He keyed the radio again. Overlord 6 Bravo 7 actual. I want to talk to whoever authorized this mission and whoever made the call on extraction. Right now. Static, then. Bravo 7 continued to evade, and I heard what you said. Nolan's voice was very quiet, which was how you knew it was serious. The men who knew him knew that the louder he was, the better he was managing. The quiet meant something different, and I am telling you that I have a man who will die in this canyon in less than 10 minutes if we don't get medical evacuation or close air support. I am telling you that the rest of my team is going to follow him if this ambush closes. I am formally documenting this transmission. Whatever happens next is on your record. Is that understood? Long pause. Bravo 7, we copy your situation. We are working the problem. Continue to... Nolan switched off the radio. Eddie looked at him. You turned it off. They don't have anything useful to say. They might. They won't. Nolan looked at his team. We do this ourselves. Here's what we're going to do. And then something happened that Nolan Briggs had not planned for and could not have predicted, which was that Danny Reyes, who had been silent and white-faced on the ground with Marcus Webb's hands over his wound, opened his mouth and said something. Chief? Nolan turned. Reyes looked at him. His voice was thin, but it was steady, and there was something in his eyes that was harder to look at than the wound of clarity, the kind that comes when a person has accepted something and is looking at you past it. Don't get anyone else killed trying to save me, Reyes said. That's an order from a lower rank, I know that, but I'm saying it anyway. Don't do it. The canyon was briefly very quiet. Then Webb said without looking up from his work, Nobody asked you, Danny. Shut up and let me do my job. Reyes almost smiled. You're going to kill me with that tourniquet, Webb. Better me than them. Hold still. Nolan turned back to his team. He felt something moving through his chest that he couldn't name exactly. It wasn't quite rage, and it wasn't quite grief, and it wasn't quite determination, but it had elements of all three, and the combined weight of 15 years of keeping men alive in places where men were not supposed to survive. Okay, he said, listen up. The plan was simple because it had to be. Two elements. Carver and Petty Officer First Class Rashid Torres would move to the eastern ridgeline position and create a diversion burn ammunition they barely had on a firing display that would make the eastern element think an assault was incoming, buying time and pulling their attention. Meanwhile, Nolan, Eddie Keller, and three others would shift their position north, find higher ground, and establish a defensive perimeter that was at least defensible in two directions rather than boxed in. Webb would stay with Reyes, 2 men with him, for security. This is not a good plan, Eddie said quietly, pulling Nolan aside while the team prepared. I know. We're burning our last ammo on a distraction. I know. And if command doesn't come through, I know, Eddie. Nolan met his eyes. I know exactly what it means. But what's the alternative? Sit here and let the range close. Let them walk right up to us. Eddie was quiet for a moment. He looked at the sky, which was doing something ominous. Clouds moving fast from the northwest, stars disappearing in sequence. The temperature already having dropped another 4 degrees in the last 30 minutes. Storm's coming, he said. Yeah. That's going to make everything worse. Most things do. Eddie actually smiled at that, a brief, genuine flash of it gone almost immediately. All right, Chief. Your call. Always has been. They had one thing going for them, and it was this Bravo 7 was the best. Not the best in the sense of rankings or evaluations or what their records said, though those things were true. The best in the sense that these 12 men had worked together long enough to operate almost without language, to anticipate each other's movements, to make decisions in the half-second gaps between incoming rounds where other units would have frozen. The execution was clean. Carver and Torres moved out in a low crawl that covered 40 meters in under 90 seconds and set up on the eastern approach with a positioning that would force any observer on the ridgeline to assume a coordinated assault. When they opened up, controlled, accurate, making every round count, the eastern position lit up with return fire that was heavy and reactive, which meant exactly what Nolan had hoped. Whoever was up there was nervous. Nervous people made mistakes. Nolan moved his element north using the terrain the way they'd been trained, finding the dead ground, the folds and shadows that the high ground shooters couldn't cover. It took 7 minutes. In those 7 minutes, he heard the eastern exchange reach a brief crescendo, and then quiet Carver and Torres, conserving ammunition, signaling through their radio that they were in position. The new terrain was better, not good, but better. And that was when Nolan turned on the radio again. He didn't call command. He wasn't calling command again tonight. Command had told him what it was going to do, which was nothing. Instead, he switched to the guard frequency, the emergency channel that every military aircraft monitored, always regardless of what else was happening, and he gave his full situation report, not to any specific call sign, just out into the air. Grid coordinates, personnel count, 1 urgent surgical, ammunition status, enemy disposition, weather incoming. He said it twice, then he signed off. That goes to everyone, Eddie said, listening. That's the idea. No one's coming, Chief. Nolan set the radio down on the rock beside him. He looked at the western ridgeline where a second enemy position had briefly gone quiet, either repositioning or waiting him out. He looked north where the canyon mouth was still theoretically open, 14 miles of hard terrain between them and anything useful. He looked at the sky, which was losing stars by the minute. Maybe not, he said, but someone hears everything. He didn't say it with confidence. He didn't say it the way a character in a movie says something meaningful, right before the cavalry arrives. He said it because he had run out of better things to say, and because he had decided somewhere in the last 45 minutes that if this was how it ended, it was not going to end with him having stayed quiet. Danny Reyes was still alive. Marcus Webb had gotten the tourniquet properly seated, and started an IV from the emergency kit. Reyes was pale and fading but conscious, and his vitals, while not good, were not immediately terminal. 10 minutes had become 15. 15 might become 20. Sometimes that was all it took. Sometimes the only strategy was to survive long enough for something to change. At Nellis Air Force Base, 47 miles to the southwest, the operations center was running the way it ran on any other night, with the particular controlled chaos of a military installation, managing multiple concurrent situations, screens alive with data, voices overlapping, the smell of bad coffee and recycled air, and institutional stress that was so constant it had become invisible. Colonel Raymond Marsh was the senior officer on duty, and he was in the middle of an argument. Not a loud argument. Colonel Marsh didn't do loud. He was 61 years old, 28 years of active service, twice decorated for strategic planning, and never not once for anything involving running toward gunfire. He had the bearing of a man who had built his career on the right side of decisions, meaning the side that when reviewed afterward appeared measured and defensible, and above all, safe. He was arguing with the weather data. Specifically, he was arguing with the radar image showing a fast-moving storm system dropping out of the northern Nevada highlands at a rate that made any flight operations in the Ashford Canyon area effectively impossible for the next 3 to 4 hours. "The weather settles, we reassess," he said to the room. "That team knows how to survive in the field. That's what they're trained for." Captain Derek Hollins, the watch officer, was 26 years younger than Marsh and had the expression of a man choosing his words with extreme care. "Sir, with respect, the team has reported an urgent surgical casualty. Blood loss. That's a time-critical situation regardless of the weather." "I understand what urgent surgical means, Captain." "Yes, sir. I just want to make sure we're documenting the timeline correctly. Because if that casualty expires while we have aircraft on the ground here, that could theoretically—" "Aircraft cannot theoretically fly into a canyon in a storm," Marsh said, and his voice had the particular flatness that meant the conversation was over. "That's not theoretical, that's physics. I will not risk aircraft and crew on a mission that the weather makes impossible." Hollins said nothing. Marsh turned back to the screens. The guard frequency transmission came in at 22:03. Nolan Briggs's voice, flat and precise and exhausted, reading coordinates and casualty counts in ammunition status into the open air. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something arrives that changes the texture of everything. Marsh listened to all of it. He didn't move. When it ended, he said, "Log it." Hollins stared at him. "Sir, log it. Continue monitoring." "So, no. That's all." He turned back to his screens, and Major Layla Vance, who was not supposed to be in the operations center at all, who was technically supposed to be in the pilot standby lounge, filling out a maintenance standby form, because her aircraft had flagged a minor hydraulic sensor anomaly at 1900, and she'd been pulled from the flight schedule, heard every word. She was standing near the coffee station in the back of the room because the standby lounge had run out of half-decent coffee at 20:30, and she had walked down the corridor and helped herself and stayed because she was the kind of person who had difficulty being in a room where something was happening without paying attention to it. She was 34 years old. She had flown the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, for 9 years, accumulated over 2,000 flight hours, including combat deployments in Iraq and Syria, and a particularly memorable 18 months in Afghanistan, where she had earned 2 air medals and a very sincere personal thank you from an Army Ranger Battalion commander, who had later sent her a framed photograph of his men with a note that just said, "You came when nobody else would." That's all there is. She had kept the photograph. It was in her quarters right now. She stood at the coffee station, and she heard 12 men's lives dismissed with the phrase, "Log it," and she felt something move through her that started in her chest and ended somewhere that was harder to describe, something cold and precise and absolute. She set down her coffee cup. "He's not sending anyone," she said to no one in particular. Captain Hollins glanced at her. He knew who she was. Everyone in the ops center knew who Layla Vance was, and his expression had the quality of a man who was thinking something that he had decided not to say. She looked at him. "My bird has a hydraulic sensor flag." "Yes, ma'am." "A sensor flag, not a hydraulic failure. The system flagged a sensor reading that was outside normal parameters for 8 seconds at altitude and then returned to normal." Yes, ma'am. That's what the maintenance log says. "And that flag grounds me." "Per protocol, yes, ma'am." Layla looked at the radio. She looked at Colonel Marsh's back, broad and resolute, and turned away from the screens that were showing her the storm system rolling down from the north. She looked at the weather data. She looked at the map overlay that showed Ashford Canyon, the team's last reported position, the distance. She had flown that canyon, not in the sim, not on paper. She had flown Ashford Canyon on a low-altitude training run 3 years ago, on a bet with a fellow pilot who had told her no one could thread the throat under 800 feet in an A-10. She had done it at 620, and she had come out the other end with her hands shaking and her heart rate at 170, and the absolute bone-deep cellular knowledge of every wind current and rock face and turn in those 14 miles. She had maps in her head that no chart could reproduce. She picked up her coffee cup again, finished it, set it down. "I'm going back to standby," she said to no one in particular. She walked out of the operations center. In the corridor alone, she stopped. She thought about the voice on the guard frequency, the precision of it, the specific exhaustion, the way a man who has done the math speaks when he is still doing the job anyway because doing the job is what there is. She thought about the framed photograph in her quarters. She thought about a hydraulic sensor that had flagged once for 8 seconds and then cleared. She thought about a canyon she knew better than anyone on this base, better than anyone in this time zone. She was already walking toward the flight line before she had finished thinking. She was already going through her pre-flight checklist in her head before she reached the door. The storm was 20 minutes out. The window was closing. Her aircraft was technically grounded. She had been told not by anyone in this building, not tonight, but somewhere back in the accumulation of her life and training, and the things that had made her who she was, she had been told that the hardest decisions were never the ones where the right answer was unclear. They were the ones where the right answer was perfectly clear and the rules were in the way. She pushed open the door to the flight line. The air hit her cold sharp, the smell of jet fuel in desert night, and the specific electric tension that comes when a storm is close. The tarmac stretched out ahead of her. Her aircraft sat on the far hard stand, the one she'd taxied to at 1900, when the flag had come up and they'd told her she was on standby. She looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she walked toward it. Behind her in the operations center, Colonel Raymond Marsh was still looking at his screens. Still not sending anyone. Still doing the calculus of risk and protocol and defensibility that would allow him to review this night later and find himself blameless. He had no idea what was about to happen. 12 men in a canyon, a woman on a tarmac, a storm that was closing fast, and a decision that had already been made. The hydraulic sensor was not a hydraulic failure. Layla had known that the moment it flagged. 8 seconds at altitude, returning to normal. That was a sensor, not a system. She had seen it before. Every A-10 pilot had seen it before, the little electronic hiccup that the maintenance protocols treated as grounds for grounding, because the protocols couldn't distinguish between a sensor anomaly and an actual system problem, and protocols were written to be safe. Safe. There was that word again. She was in the cockpit. Her hands moved through the pre-flight with the automatic precision of 9 years and 2,000 hours, touching each control in sequence. Her eyes moving across the instruments. Everything was where it was supposed to be. The hydraulic system read normal, had read normal since 1908. The sensor that had flagged was silent. Her radio was on the guard frequency. She heard nothing new from Bravo 7. That could mean anything. It could mean they'd gone silent for tactical reasons. It could mean the radios were compromised. It could mean other things she chose not to think about. She ran through her weapons check. The A-10 was loaded the way it always was on training standby live ordnance because the Air Force had learned long ago that the 15 minutes it took to switch from training rounds to live rounds in a developing situation was 15 minutes you didn't have. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon that ran through the center line of the aircraft, 30 millimeters of physics, 4,000 rounds per minute. The thing that made the Warthog what it was hot. The Mavericks were hot. She had everything she needed. Her radio crackled. Different frequency, the base operations channel. Major Vance, it was Hollins's voice. He'd seen her on the flight line cameras. Major Vance, please confirm your status. She keyed her mic. Standby pilot conducting pre-flight check. Ma'am, your aircraft is grounded pending maintenance clearance. The sensor cleared at 1908, Captain, 41 minutes after the initial flag. I'm documenting the time now. A pause. She could hear him working through it, the rules, the protocol, the gap between what the paperwork said and what she was saying. I need to flag this to Colonel Marsh, ma'am. Copy that. She ran the last pre-flight items. Major Vance, repeat bus. A different voice. Marsh, he'd move fast. Stand down. That is a direct order. Her hands paused on the throttle. She thought about Danny Reyes, 24 years old, bleeding in a canyon, trying to tell his team leader not to get anyone killed on his behalf. She thought about 12 men doing the math and not liking the answer and doing the job anyway. She thought about a photograph on her wall and a note that said, "You came when nobody else would." Colonel Tequillon, she said, and her voice was completely steady. I'm documenting this transmission. Bravo 7 has one urgent surgical and is in contact with hostile elements at the coordinates logged from the guard frequency transmission at 2203. I am the only qualified aircraft commander on this base with direct operational knowledge of the Ashford Canyon terrain. My aircraft is flight ready. I am launching. Dead silence on the radio. Then Marsh's voice, very quiet, very hard. Major Vance, if you lift off, I will have you court-martialed. She looked at the storm line visible now on the northwest horizon, a dark mass erasing the stars. She looked at the coordinates on her kneeboard, the grid that Nolan Briggs had read out in that flat, precise, exhausted voice twice to anyone who was listening. She looked at the photograph she didn't have with her, but could see perfectly well. Yes, sir, she said. I expect you will. She pushed the throttle forward. The A-10's twin T, F-34 engines, which were not beautiful engines in the way that fighter jet engines are beautiful. They were industrial engines, honest engines, built for endurance and punishment, and showing up began their climb to full power. The ground fell away. Layla Vance banked northwest and pointed her aircraft at the storm, and at the canyon beyond it, and at the 12 men who were still, as far as she knew, alive. The radio crackled with Marsh's voice one more time, something about court-martial and direct orders and her career, and she turned the volume down to 0. She had a canyon to fly. Nolan Briggs heard it at 2231. Not the aircraft, not yet. The A-10 was still minutes out, still fighting the storm on approach. But the radio, his radio, which he had kept on the guard frequency, which suddenly spoke in a voice that was female and calm and utterly matter-of-fact. Bravo 7, actual, this is Storm 01. I have your grid. I'm inbound. Estimated time to your position, 11 minutes. Keep your heads down and talk to me. The canyon was quiet except for wind and the occasional crack of distant rifle fire from the eastern position and the sound of Marcus Webb doing what Marcus Webb did. Nolan stared at the radio. Eddie next to him said nothing. But he let out a breath, slow, controlled, the kind of breath that isn't quite relief because relief is premature, and they both knew it, but was something adjacent to it, something that had room for the possibility. Nolan keyed his mic. His voice came out steady the way it had come out steady for 15 years of things that should have broken it and hadn't. Storm 01, Bravo 7 actual copies. Welcome to the neighborhood. It's not great. A brief pause. I've seen worse. Her voice had something in it, not humor exactly, but the kind of acknowledgement that passed between people who had both been in rooms where things were not great. I know this canyon. I need your exact current position relative to the eastern ridgeline, and I need to know where the enemy is. Nolan almost said something about how he hadn't expected a woman's voice. He stopped himself immediately because it was irrelevant, and also because the fact that she knew this canyon in the dark in a storm and was coming anyway was the only thing that mattered. Copy that, Storm 01, he said. Here's what you're flying into. He started talking. 11 minutes. He could work with 11 minutes. The eastern ridgeline position shifted. He could hear movement up there, the crunch of boots on rock. Someone repositioning. They'd heard the radio transmission. Maybe they'd heard the aircraft. The A-10 wasn't quiet. That was one of the things about it that was terrifying if you were on the wrong side. At altitude, it was a hum. Getting closer was something else. Getting closer, it was the last thing some people ever heard. They're moving, Keller reported from his corner. Eastern position is splitting. Some of them are going higher, some moving south. They're trying to get angle on the canyon entrance. They know she's coming, Eddie said. Good, said Nolan. And he meant it because an enemy that was repositioning to deal with incoming air support was an enemy that was not focused entirely on the 12 men on the ground. Let them worry about her. He keyed the radio again. Storm 01, be advised, eastern position is moving, possible attempt to establish anti-air or man-portable capability at higher elevation. Estimated split half repositioning north and up, half moving south. Copy that. Her voice hadn't changed. Still calm, still matter of fact. That actually helps me. Stay on this frequency. I'm going to need you to mark your position when I call for it. Standing by. He looked at his team. He looked at Marcus Webb, who had not moved from Danny Reyes' side, who had performed a kind of sustained medical miracle in the back of a firefight with what amounted to a trauma kit and force of will. He looked at Reyes himself, who was conscious, still conscious, and who was looking at the sky with an expression that was complicated, inhuman, and impossible to name. 9 minutes now. 9 minutes until something descended through the storm. 9 minutes until the night changed. Nolan Briggs had survived a lot of things. He had survived them by staying in the present, by refusing the future until it arrived, by keeping the math limited to what was immediately in front of him. He stayed there now, in the present, in the cold, in the dark, in the wind. He listened to the guard frequency. He waited. 22:31, 9 minutes out. Layla had flown in bad weather before. She had flown in rain so thick it turned the canopy into a waterfall in crosswinds that tried to flip a 30,000-pound aircraft like a playing card in dust storms in the Helmand Valley, that reduced visibility to zero and turned the world outside the cockpit into a wall of brown nothing. She had come out the other side of all of it, and she had come out clean, because she was good at this, not in the way people say they are good at things, but in the bone-deep, unreflective way that only comes from years of the kind of repetition that stops feeling like practice and starts feeling like memory. But this was different. The storm hit her at 3,200 feet, 12 miles out from Ashford Canyon, and it hit her the way a wall hits you. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, the turbulence slamming the airframe like a fist, the altimeter swinging the wind shear coming in from the northwest, at angles that made no sense on paper and perfect terrifying sense in the seat. She felt it in her back teeth. She felt it in her hands on the stick. She corrected again, held the nose where she needed it. Storm 01, talk to me. Nolan's voice came through on the guard frequency, steady enough that she could almost pretend he was sitting next to her in a briefing room somewhere. 9 minutes means 9 minutes of those guys up on the ridgeline still repositioning. Eastern position has gone silent. That worries me more than when they were shooting. Copy that. She banked 3 degrees left, fighting a crosswind gust that wanted to push her south. Silent usually means they found what they were looking for. My thought exactly. What's your man-portable air defense situation? Anyone up there likely to have a man-pad? A pause. She could hear him thinking. Negative confirmed, he said, but I wouldn't bet a warthog on it. Noted. She dropped 200 feet, ducking under the worst of the shear layer. The ride smoothed slightly, not smooth, nothing was smooth tonight, but marginally less violent. I'm going to come in from the north. Stay on comms. When I call for it, I need you to mark your position with IR strobe, 1 strobe, southeast corner of your perimeter. You'll be able to see it in this weather. I'll find it. He didn't ask how. She appreciated that. The canyon entrance appeared on her terrain-following radar at 22:34, the rock walls rising out of the darkness below her like the edges of something that had been split open and never healed. She'd been here before. She held that in her mind the way you hold a tool, not for comfort, but because it was useful. She knew the first turn a left bend at the canyon's northern mouth that looked gradual on the map, but tightened faster than it appeared, the wall coming up on your right while you were still thinking it had more room. She knew the wind pocket 2 miles in where the canyon narrowed enough to create an updraft effect that could gain you 300 feet of altitude you hadn't asked for. She knew the throat. She dropped to 800 feet and went in. Bravo 7 Storm 01 is entering the canyon. 2 minutes. Copy. A beat. You sound calm. I am calm. How? She thought about it for exactly 1 second. Because I already decided. Calm comes after you decide. Another crack of turbulence hit the airframe, violent enough to snap her head sideways. She corrected and kept going. Behind her at Nellis, she was quite certain that Colonel Raymond Marsh was either on the phone with someone who outranked him or composing the beginning of her court-martial paperwork. Possibly both. The certainty of that should have created some feeling in her anxiety, doubt the particular cold dread of watching your career become past tense. It didn't. There was something clarifying about having already crossed a line. The energy she would have spent on second-guessing had been redirected somewhere more immediately useful, like not flying into a canyon wall at 400 knots. "Southeast strobe on your call," Nolan said. "Ready when you are. Stand by." She came through the first turn, the right wall looming in her peripheral vision, and then dropping back as the canyon widened briefly. The turbulence was constant now, not the slamming burst of the approach, but a grinding, sustained buffeting that required continuous correction, her hands never fully still. 20 seconds. She checked her weapons display. The GAU-8 was armed. 2 Maverick missiles, one on each wing pylon, designated for precision work if she needed it. She had CBU cluster rounds she wouldn't use this close to friendlies. She had the cannon, which was what this canyon was for short range, devastating point blank if necessary. 10 seconds, mark. The IR strobe lit up below, and to her right a pulse of infrared light, invisible to anyone without night vision equipment and absolutely unmistakable to her sensors, a single bright heartbeat in the dark telling her exactly where 12 men were trying to survive. She had it. She pulled left hard, keeping the strobe at her 2 o'clock, and she found the eastern ridgeline with her eyes there, the higher ground, the dark mass of rock where movement had been reported. Her targeting system tracked. "Storm 01 has your position," she said. "Eastern ridgeline, confirm enemy on the high north end." "Confirmed, Ikiraman. They moved 2 or 3 personnel up there in the last 6 minutes. Don't know what they're carrying." "Copy." She made the decision in the time it took to exhale. "Guns, keep your heads down." She rolled in. The GAU-8 fired, and the sound was unlike anything else on Earth. Not a bang, not an explosion, but a sound like God tearing cardboard, a mechanical roar that was both very loud and strangely brief. Each burst measured in fractions of a second, while the 30-millimeter rounds walked their way across the ridgeline in a pattern that left nothing standing that had been standing before. On the ground, 11 men heard it. On the ground, 1 man, Petty Officer Second Class Danny Reyes, who was losing blood and consciousness in roughly equal measure, opened his eyes. And in the operations center at Nellis Air Force Base, Captain Derek Hollins, who had stayed at his station because that was his job, and because somewhere inside him was the small, stubborn flame of a person who believed that watching and knowing mattered, even when you couldn't act, heard the guard frequency transmission and closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, and then opened them and started writing the most detailed timeline log of the evening that anyone had ever compiled in that building. Because whatever happened next, someone needed to have written down what actually occurred. 22:36, Storm 01 on target, first engagement. The night was just getting started. The first pass silenced the northern high ground. Layla didn't know if she'd killed anyone. She never spent time on that during a run. Death was the necessary mathematics of what the aircraft was for, and the moral weight of it was something she carried on the ground and quiet where it belonged. Right now, what mattered was outcome. The northern high ground was no longer shooting, which meant the personnel who had repositioned there were either down or relocating. And either way, they were not immediately targeting the team below. She pulled out of the run into a climbing left turn, fighting the turbulence, getting altitude back. The canyon walls fell away below her. The storm was pushing harder from the northwest, the wind shifting in a way that changed every calculation she'd made on the inbound. She made new calculations. "Good effect on the north position." Nolan's voice. "We still have the southern element. They pulled back when you came in, but they haven't broken contact. I count at least 4 personnel, maybe 6, approximately 400 meters south-southwest of our position. They're using the canyon wall for cover." "How close are they to your perimeter?" "Close enough that if they decide to push in the next 10 minutes, it's a problem. I need a precise bearing. 235 degrees from my strobe, maybe 400 meters. They've been hugging the western wall. There's an overhang down there. I don't have line of sight to them directly, but I can hear them." Layla processed that. Western wall overhang at 235 degrees from the strobe. She knew exactly where that was. She had flown past it on that training run 3 years ago and noted it specifically because the overhang created a radar shadow, something she'd filed away as a tactical consideration for exactly the kind of thing she was dealing with right now. The cannon wouldn't work on a covered position. She'd need something with more angle. "Copy that. I'm going to need about 90 seconds to set up the angle on the western wall position. Can you hold? We've been holding for an hour. 90 seconds is practically a vacation. She almost smiled. Storm 01 is repositioning. She climbed to 1,200 feet, pushing north to find an angle that would let her work the western wall without the overhang shielding the position. The turbulence at 1,200 was worse than at 800. She was back in the full disruption zone, the airframe shuttering the wind shear trying to pull her sideways. She held the aircraft with the specific combination of muscle memory and active correction that you didn't learn in flight school, but in the long repetition of hours that followed. Her radio crackled different frequency. Base operations still live, still monitoring. Someone had the sense not to key it, or they were composing themselves, or they'd given up. She didn't have time to care. The angle she needed opened up at 1,220 feet in 8 degrees of offset from her original approach. She rolled in steep, the canyon walls filling her peripheral vision as she descended the western overhang, coming into her targeting site at the specific angle she'd calculated, not from above, because the overhang blocked that, but from the north-northwest, slicing under the rock at an oblique that the people sheltering under it would not have anticipated. The Maverick locked. She fired. The missile tracked cleanly off the rail, stabilized, and found the designated point under the western overhang with the kind of accuracy that still, after 9 years of doing this, made something in her chest do a complicated thing. Precision was its own language. It said, I see exactly where you are. It said you are not hidden. The explosion was not visible to her at pull-out altitude. What she saw was the flash and then nothing, which was its own information. She came off the run, climbing hard, getting altitude back, and heard something on the guard frequency that she had not expected. It was not Nolan Briggs. It was a second voice, younger, rougher, with an undertone of effort that told her the speaker was working to produce it. Storm 01. A pause, breathing. Danny Reyes, Bravo 7. I just wanted to say another pause, shorter, like he was deciding something. I just wanted to make sure you knew someone down here heard you coming. She held the aircraft steady. She said very carefully, copy that, Reyes, how are you doing? I'm okay. He wasn't, obviously. But there was something in the way he said it that was not a lie. It was an act of will presented as a fact which was different. My wife's going to have our kid in 2 months. I know. She didn't know specifically, but it was the right thing to say in the way that some true things are right for reasons beyond their literal content. I'll get you home for it. Silence on the frequency. Then Nolan's voice back, professional and steady. Storm 01, we still have the eastern position. The lower element didn't break. They've pulled back to about 300 meters east, and they're set up behind the rock formation on the canyon floor. At least 4 personnel. Copy. She was already running the geometry. Eastern floor 300 meters from the Strobe rock formation. That was close. That was close enough that she was going to be working within the margins of what the manual called inadvisable and what the people who wrote the manual called a last resort. I can work that, she said, but I need you to be exact on your perimeter. I can give you a second strobe. We have one more IR marker, northwest corner of our position. Do it. 2 strobes lets me bracket the friendly position. Anyone between the southeast and northwest strobes and east of the line, that's my engagement zone. Understood. A pause. Chief, that was Eddie's voice in the background, addressing Nolan. She knows what she's doing. She heard it because his radio was open. She filed it away without responding to it because there was no time, and also because she was focused on the eastern floor position, which was the most dangerous engagement of the night, close to friendlies, low altitude, confined terrain, heavy turbulence. She set up the run. This was where it got technical. The eastern floor engagement required her to come in from the north at an angle shallow enough to avoid the canyon walls on either side while still achieving the depression angle necessary to put 30mm rounds on a floor-level target without overshooting into the team's position to the west. The math was straightforward on paper. In a storm in a canyon at night with turbulence that was currently trying to roll her aircraft 20 degrees off her intended heading every 8 seconds, the math became something else. It became feel. She had it. She knew she had it the way, I know you have something that you've done 10,000 times in 10,000 variations, not because you're certain, but because you're so inside the process that certainty and action have become the same thing. She keyed her mic. Second strobe up. Up, Nolan said. She found them both two infrared pulses in the darkness below southeast and northwest, the boundary of where 12 men were alive. Everything east of that line. She rolled in. The run was 41 seconds from start to pull out. She knew that afterward because she thought about it, counted it back. In the moment, it was not 41 seconds. It was a series of continuous decisions, each one producing the next, the aircraft responding and the turbulence fighting, and her hands never fully at rest, corrections running up her arms and into her shoulders and back, the canyon floor coming up fast, and the target in her sight, in the GAU-8, firing in short controlled bursts that walked the rounds exactly where she put them. The pull-out was violent turbulence hit her at the lowest point of the run, a sharp updraft that tried to send her nose into the eastern wall, and she pushed it down hard, graying out briefly at the bottom of the G-force curve, her vision tunneling and then clearing as she climbed. She came out at 800 feet with her heart rate at 160 and her hands steady and the eastern floor position behind her silent. Storm 01 talked to me, Nolan said. I'm up. She leveled off, fighting for altitude, fighting the storm. Eastern floor. A 2-second pause that lasted longer than 2 seconds. Gone, Nolan said. One word, the weight of it was considerable. She exhaled slowly. Storm 01, he said, and his voice had shifted slightly. The operational flatness still there, but something else underneath it now. Something that wasn't quite a motion, but was in the same country. We still have the original northern ridgeline position, the other half the ones that moved south when you came in. They haven't shown themselves, but I can hear them. Maybe 300 meters north-northeast. They've gone quiet. Quiet again. Yeah. She thought about the northern ridgeline. She thought about personnel who had gone quiet after a devastating first pass, who had watched 2 other positions destroyed, who were now in the dark making their own calculations. Sometimes quiet meant broken. Sometimes it meant something else. I'm going to make another pass over the northern ridgeline, she said. Not a weapons run, a show of force. I want them to hear the aircraft. You want to scare them. I want to give them an opportunity to make a better decision. Nolan was quiet for a moment. You're giving them an out. I'm giving them a reason to take it. She set up the approach. People who've watched 2 positions disappear in 4 minutes usually want an out. I'd rather they take it than spend rounds I might need later. You're almost out of ordnance. She glanced at her weapon status. He was right, she'd used the Maverick. She'd burned significant cannon rounds on 2 passes, and she had enough for 1 more decisive engagement and maybe 2 lighter ones. In a sustained fight that was thin. How'd you know that? I've worked with warthogs before. I know what the loadout looks like, and I've been counting. She felt something that in another context might have been called appreciation. He was good. That helped, having someone on the ground who understood the aircraft. You're correct, she said. So I'd prefer the northern ridgeline goes away on its own. Copy that, running the show of force. She came in low and fast over the northern ridgeline, not attacking, just present the twin engines screaming through the canyon at an altitude that put her close enough to the rock that she could feel the turbulence bouncing off the canyon walls. The aircraft was its own announcement. The sound it made at that altitude, at that speed, in an enclosed space was something that went past the ears and into the chest. She pulled up and circled back. Northern ridgeline, she asked. Movement, Keller's voice in the background. They're moving away, going north. I count 3, maybe 4 personnel heading for the canyon exit. Let them go, Nolan said, and that was directed at his team, not her. Then to her, Storm 01, I think they're done. She came around in a wide orbit, watching the radar, watching the terrain. 3 minutes passed. No new fire, no repositioning. The canyon below her was quiet in the specific way that was different from the quiet that meant someone was setting up. This was the other quiet, the aftermath quiet. Bravo 7, she said. I'm going to orbit your position until you can give me a full situation report. Copy that. A pause during which she could hear him speaking to his team low and quick, and then the responses coming back, and then silence again before he keyed the mic. Storm 01, Bravo 7 situation, no new hostile contact, 3 minutes and counting. All personnel accounted for. 11 ambulatory, 1 urgent surgical condition stable, I repeat, stable. Webbs held him. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. Copy Bravo 7, that's good news. Best news I've had tonight. Another pause, different quality. Listen, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Did you come out here alone? No wing, no backup. Affirmative. Silence. Then command, no, you're out here. She considered several possible answers. Command is aware of my departure, she said. He processed that. She could almost hear him processing it. So you launched against orders. I launched on my own determination that the situation required it. Another silence, longer this time. Why, he said, and it wasn't the question of a man who doubted her decision. It was the question of a man who needed to understand something the way you need to understand a thing that already happened to you and that you're still in the middle of. She thought about what to say. She'd thought about a lot of things tonight, but this one she hadn't prepared because she hadn't expected to be asked. Because the call came in on the guard frequency, she said finally, and I know this canyon, and nobody else was going. More silence. When Nolan Briggs spoke again, his voice had the quality of a man who had been holding something in a fist for a long time and was now carefully opening his hand. Well, he said, okay, that was all. 2 words. But the weight behind them was the weight of 11 men who had been looking at the math and not liking the answer, and who were now for the first time in over an hour looking at something else. She kept her orbit. The storm was not done. It was, in fact, intensifying the turbulence, getting worse rather than better, the wind shear at her current altitude becoming increasingly aggressive. She was burning fuel. She had been burning fuel since she lit the engines, and the basic physics of the situation meant she had a limited time before she needed to think about where she was going to put the aircraft. She had not, she realized fully, thought through the landing part. This was technically speaking a problem. Bravo 7, I need to ask you something now, she said. Shoot. What's your extraction situation? Because I can keep this orbit for approximately 40 more minutes before my fuel state becomes a factor, and I'd like to have you on the ground at a pickup point before that becomes critical. Command has been non-responsive. I know, I'm not asking about command. She had an idea that had been forming since approximately the moment she lit the engines, the idea of a person who had already broken one rule and was now doing the specific arithmetic of how many more rules needed to break in sequence. Is there a point at the Northern Canyon exit that a vehicle could access ground extraction, not air? A long pause. Nolan, Eddie's voice off mic but audible. She's right. Ground route, the service road. Nolan came back. There's a BLM service road that hits the canyon exit approximately 12 miles north of our current position. Unpaved, narrow, but accessible by 4-wheel drive in current conditions. Is there any asset in range? Another pause. Longer. And then something happened that she had not expected, which was that a third voice cut into the guard frequency. Not Nolan, not Eddie, not anyone in the canyon. A different voice. Male, authoritative, with the specific cadence of someone who had been listening for a long time and had decided that the time for listening was over. Bravo 7 Storm 01, this is Ranger 5. I'm a Nevada National Guard convoy commander, 12 miles north of your position on Route 318. I've been monitoring the guard frequency for 40 minutes. I have 3 vehicles and 18 personnel. Tell me where you need me. The canyon went quiet. Then Nolan said very slowly, very quietly, say that again, Ranger 5. 12 miles north, 3 vehicles, 18 guard personnel. Tell me where to go. She felt something shift in the cockpit. Not a physical thing, not turbulence, but something that happened in the quality of the moment itself, the way moments sometimes change their character entirely in the space of a single transmission. You've been listening this whole time, she asked. We were running a training exercise on Route 318 when the guard frequency lit up, the convoy commander said. My name is Captain Andres Reyes. A pause. My brother's name is Daniel. I don't know if that's relevant. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Ranger 5, Nolan said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had done the math again and gotten a different answer. I need you to move to the Northern Canyon exit at maximum speed. I will have 11 ambulatory personnel and 1 litter patient waiting for you. Storm 01 will guide you in. Moving now, the convoy commander said. ETA 10 minutes. She reoriented her orbit to cover the Northern Canyon approach. She could hear below her on the ground the sound of Nolan issuing movement orders, quick, precise, the machinery of the team shifting from defensive hold to coordinated extraction. 12 men who had been calculating their deaths now calculating something else. She ran her fuel figures. She was going to be tight. She was going to be very tight. There was a dry lake bed approximately 8 miles east of the canyon exit that she had noted on the map as an emergency landing surface. Not ideal, not paved, not lit, not anything but flat and long enough for an A-10 if you came in right. She would deal with that in 40 minutes. Right now, she watched the canyon below her, and she listened to the team move, and she felt the storm pushing at her airframe. And she thought about Danny Reyes, who had opened his eyes in the dark and keyed a radio to make sure someone knew he had heard her coming. She thought about his brother in 3 vehicles on Route 318, who had been listening on a guard frequency and made a decision. She thought about Captain Hollins at Nellis, who was probably writing everything down. She thought about Colonel Marsh. She held her orbit, and she watched, and she was ready if anything moved in the canyon below, and nothing did. And the minutes went by, and at 22:58, 27 minutes after she had entered the canyon, for the first time, Nolan Briggs came back on the guard frequency. Storm 01 Bravo 7 is moving to the extraction point. All personnel, 1 litter. We are mobile. She came around in the orbit, pointing north, watching the terrain. I have you, she said. And she did. Below her in the dark, 12 men moved through the canyon they had been left to die in, and they were alive, and they were moving north, and somewhere ahead of them, 3 vehicles were pushing down a dirt road as fast as they could go, and somewhere behind all of it, a storm was doing what storms do, which is not care about any of it. She flew. She kept flying. Her fuel gauge continued its steady, honest arithmetic towards 0.2, 258. Moving. Nolan had moved men under fire before. He had moved them through mountain passes in Afghanistan, where every step could be the last one, through flooded wadis in Iraq where the current wanted to take you and the darkness wanted to hide what the current was bringing. He had moved broken men and frightened men, and men who were running on nothing but the particular stubbornness that the team spent years building into you, the refusal to stop that became so habitual, it stopped feeling like courage and started feeling like breathing. He had never moved a team quite like this. 12 men, one on a litter that Carver and Torres were carrying between them, in a 2-man carry that made both of them breathe through their teeth, moving north through Ashford Canyon at the best pace they could manage, which was not fast enough and was going to have to be fast enough anyway. The wind was coming down the canyon from the north directly in their faces, cold and sharp, and carrying the smell of the storm that was still pushing through. The temperature had dropped another 6 degrees in the last 20 minutes. Danny Reyes on the litter had stopped talking 10 minutes ago, which worried Marcus Webb more than the wound itself at this point. He's conserving, Webb said, reading the question on Nolan's face before it was asked. He was walking alongside the litter, one hand periodically checking the IV line he'd run. Pulse is weak, but it's there. He needs a surgical suite in the next hour, maybe 90 minutes if we're lucky with the blood pressure. Ranger 5 said 10 minutes to the canyon exit. Then we need to walk faster. Nolan looked at the 2 men carrying the litter. Carver was 6'4" and built like something load-bearing, and even he was feeling the weight. The set of his jaw said so, the angle of his shoulders. Torres was smaller, but had that particular compact efficiency that the smaller operators often had, no wasted movement, every step doing exactly what it needed to do. They were good. They were both going to feel this tomorrow, in places they'd forgotten they had. 3-minute rotation on the litter, Nolan said to Eddie, who nodded and immediately started tapping replacements. Overhead, he could hear Layla's aircraft. He couldn't always see the storm in the darkness made that intermittent, but the sound of those twin engines was present, steady, orbiting somewhere above the canyon. It was the most reassuring sound he had heard in several hours, which was a thing he would have found absurd if someone had told him about it beforehand. An aircraft engine. Reassuring. But there it was. Storm 01, he said quietly, not breaking stride. We're moving. How does the canyon look to you from up there? Clear, she said. Northern approach is clear. Ranger 5 is on the dirt road. I can see headlights. They're moving fast. Copy. He looked at Eddie, who gave him the same look back. The National Guard convoy. Andres Reyes, whose brother was on this litter. That was a thing that kept trying to become something larger in Nolan's mind, and he kept redirecting it because the emotional weight of it was real and would need to be processed, and right now was not the time. Carver, he said, keeping his voice low, pace. Carver picked it up. Torres matched him without being told. The team flowed around them, maintaining spacing, everyone watching their sectors by habit even now. even when the threat had apparently evaporated, because habit was what kept you alive in the moment when the apparently evaporated threat turned out to be wrong. They had covered approximately half a mile when the radio changed. Not the guard frequency. The command frequency, the one Nolan had turned to minimal volume but not off because some part of him had always maintained the discipline of keeping at least one ear on command, even when command was useless. The voice that came through now was not Marsh's voice and was not the TOC watch officer's voice. It was a voice he had not heard tonight, and it came with a different energy. Entirely the energy of someone who had just arrived at a situation and was trying to understand very quickly what had happened in their absence. All stations, this is Bravo Command. Actual, I am taking control of this operational frequency. Bravo 7 report status. Storm 01, identify yourself and report status. Nolan kept walking. He looked at the radio in his hand. Who is that? Eddie asked. Don't know. Higher than Marsh based on the call sign. You going to answer? In a minute. He needed a minute because whoever Bravo Command Actual was, they were going to ask questions that had answers, and some of those answers had consequences, and he needed to be very precise about what he said, because the next few minutes of transmissions were going to be in a lot of logs that a lot of people were going to read later. He keyed the mic, Bravo Command Actual, Bravo 7 Actual. We are mobile northbound in Ashford Canyon ETA to Canyon exit approximately 8 minutes. 1 urgent surgical, 11 ambulatory. We have ground extraction inbound from Ranger 5 Nevada National Guard. We are under air cover from Storm 01. We are not in current contact. A pause. Bravo 7 confirms Storm 01 is in OA-10 from Nellis. Affirm. Another pause. Longer. Storm 01 identify. She answered immediately, and she answered the same way she had answered everything tonight, without drama, without performance, just clean and direct. Storm 01 is Major Layla Vance, a 10 Nellis. I launched at 22:19 in response to Bravo 7's guard frequency transmission at 22:03. I am currently in low orbit over the extraction route. I have expended approximately 60% ordnance. I have approximately 30 minutes of fuel remaining before I need to recover. The silence on the command frequency had a different quality now. It had the quality of a room where a lot of people were listening and nobody wanted to be the first to speak. Major Vance, Bravo Command. Actual said carefully, are you aware that you launched without authorization? Yes, sir. And you did so anyway. Yes, sir. Another silence. Then unexpectedly, what is the current status of the canyon? Is the threat neutralized? Affirm. Eastern floor position destroyed. Western overhang position destroyed. Northern ridgeline element scattered last observed moving north out of the canyon on foot. No new contact in approximately 17 minutes. Nolan kept walking while he listened. He had covered another 300 meters. Carver and Torres had rotated off the litter. Keller and Petty Officer First Class Raymond Osei had taken over. Osei being the kind of steady that was easy to underestimate until you needed it. Major Vance. Bravo Command Actual's voice had shifted slightly. I need you to maintain your current orbit until Bravo 7 is clear of the canyon. Can you do that with your current fuel state? I can maintain orbit for approximately 25 more minutes and still have fuel to reach an emergency landing surface. What surface? Dry lake bed 8 miles east of the canyon exit. I've identified it as serviceable for an A-10 landing in current conditions. A very long pause. That's not an airfield, Major. No, sir, it is not. Have you landed on an unimproved surface before, Bo? Yes, sir, once in Afghanistan, a river gravel bar. This will be easier. Nolan almost stopped walking. He caught himself and kept the pace. Eddie, he said quietly. I heard, Eddie said. He was looking straight ahead, but his jaw had the set it got when he was working to keep his expression neutral. She's going to land on a lake bed. She's been carrying the whole night. Yeah. Keep moving. Eddie kept moving. They all kept moving. The canyon walls were beginning to open up. He could feel it more than see it, the quality of the wind changing the sound of it, the slight widening of the space around them. The exit was close. Storm 01, right? He said. We're coming up on the exit. I can feel the canyon opening. Copy that. Ranger 5 is 2 minutes out from the exit on the service road. I have them on visual, 3 vehicles, lights on. They are moving and they are fast. He turned to Webb. 2 minutes. Webb looked at Danny on the litter. Danny's eyes were closed. His breathing was visible, shallow but regular. 2 minutes is okay, Webb said, and he said it with the focused precision of a man who was constantly doing math he didn't share with anyone else. 2 minutes is fine. They came out of the canyon at 2309. The service road was exactly where it was supposed to be, a rutted dirt track cutting northeast from the canyon mouth, and the headlights were coming down it at a speed that suggested the driver was either highly competent or had made a decision about acceptable risk, similar to the ones being made by everyone else tonight. The lead vehicle, a Guard HMMWV, braked hard and stopped 20 meters from the team, and the door opened, and a man got out, and he was running before he had fully cleared the vehicle. He was maybe 30 years old, dark-haired in National Guard utilities, and he ran directly to the litter without stopping, without asking, dropping to one knee beside it and putting his hand on his brother's face. "Danny," his voice was wrecked. He was Captain Andres Reyes, and he had been on a radio for 40 minutes, listening to the sound of his brother's situation, and he was now here, and the distance between those two states had apparently done something considerable to his composure. "Danny, hey." Danny Reyes opened his eyes. He looked at his brother for a long moment. His voice came out thin, private something that the men around them were careful not to hear too directly. "You're supposed to be in a vehicle," Danny said. "That's a very dramatic entrance." "Shut up," Andres said. "You're getting in my truck." Your team is getting in my trucks too, all of them." Andres looked up at Nolan standing over the litter, and there was something in his face that was not quite thanks and was not quite relief and was something rawer and harder to categorize. "Get your men in the vehicles, Chief. We move in 60 seconds. Nolan looked at him for 1 second. Then he turned to his team. "Load up." They loaded fast, the way they did everything, not rushed but efficient, every man knowing what he was doing without being told. The litter went in the back of the second vehicle with Webb alongside and Andres climbing in after his brother before anyone could stop him, which nobody tried to do. Nolan took the front vehicle. Eddie had the third. Before Nolan got in, he stopped. He turned his radio to the guard frequency one last time. "Storm 01, he said. "We are loaded. We are moving. All personnel are accounted for." A pause. Then her voice steady as it had been from the beginning. "Copy Bravo 7. Good to hear it. What's your status?" "I am going to maintain orbit for 5 more minutes, and then I am going to find that lake bed." He looked at the sky. The storm was churning overhead, low clouds moving fast, no stars visible anywhere now. "Can you land on that lake bed in this weather?" "I'm going to." He noted the difference between those two sentences. He held his radio, and he stood at the side of the vehicle, and he looked at the sky that was hiding an aircraft and a woman he had never met, and he felt something move through him that was complicated and real. "Storm 01, he said, "I need you to know something." "Chief, you don't have to." "I need you to know that I am going to make sure someone hears what you did tonight. All of it. Not a summary, not a report. All of it." The frequency was quiet for 3 seconds. "Get your men to a hospital," she said. He got in the vehicle. Andres' driver, a solid silent specialist, who apparently had decided that the way to deal with tonight was to drive as if his life depended on it, which it did had the HMMWV moving before Nolan's door was fully closed. They drove north. Back to 2314. The lake bed. Layla had 5 minutes of orbit left when the command frequency came back, and this time it was Bravo Command, actual again, and he said something she had not expected. "Major Vance, I have been in contact with Nellis. Your aircraft has been formally cleared by maintenance. The hydraulic sensor flag was officially signed off at 1908. That is in the record." She processed that. Someone filed the clearance paperwork. "Captain Hollins, he filed it at 2205, 2 minutes after the guard frequency transmission. He apparently anticipated that someone might need it." A pause that contained things unsaid. "He's a good officer." "Yes, sir, he is." "That means you were not technically flying a grounded aircraft." "No, sir." "However, you were flying without authorization." "Yes, sir." Another pause. She had the distinct impression of a man choosing between several versions of the conversation he was about to have. "Major Vance, Colonel Marsh has filed a formal complaint requesting court-martial proceedings." "I expected that, sir." "He has that right." "Yes, sir." "I also have rights in this situation." Bravo Command and Actual said. And his voice had shifted again into something measured and deliberate, the voice of a person making a record. And I intend to exercise them fully, but that conversation is for tomorrow. Tonight I need you to land that aircraft safely. Is that understood? Understood, sir. The lake bed at grid Atatin, he gave her the coordinates which matched what she had identified. Nellis is dispatching a recovery team. They will have the surface marked with chem lights before you arrive if you can give them 15 minutes. She ran the math. 15 minutes is tight on my fuel. Can you stretch it? She looked at her fuel gauge. She reduced her orbit radius, cutting the distance she was covering per minute, reducing fuel burn. It was not a large margin, it was a margin. I can give them 12. Do it. Recovery team is moving now. She tightened her orbit and she flew. And she watched her fuel state with the particular attention that you give to a thing that is counting down. And she thought about 12 minutes in a dry lake bed in a storm, in a recovery team with chem lights. And she thought about Nolan Briggs in a National Guard vehicle, moving north on a dirt road with his team around him, and one of them going to a hospital, and one of them going home to a wife who was 7 months pregnant. She thought about Captain Hollins, who had filed clearance paperwork at 2205 for a sensor that had cleared at 1908, who had been writing the timeline, log all night, who was 29 years old and apparently had a complete understanding of what the night was going to require before most of the people involved had figured it out. She thought about Andres Reyes on Route 318 with 3 vehicles who had been monitoring the guard frequency and made a decision in the space of a single transmission. She thought about the way decisions move through people on nights like this, not like orders, not top down, but laterally one person to the next, each one seeing what needed to happen and doing it without waiting for permission. The storm pushed at her airframe. She corrected and held. At 23:21, 12 minutes and 40 seconds after she had spoken to Bravo Command, she saw them faint green points in the darkness below a double row of chem lights, marking a strip of the dry lake bed 800 meters long and wide enough for her landing gear. Storm 01 has the lake bed in sight, she said. Recovery team confirms, came back a new voice, ground crew, professional calm. Surface is hard packed. Wind is northwest at 18 knots, gusting to 25. You have 800 meters of usable surface, 18 knots gusting to 25. That was a crosswind component she needed to account for, and she worked it into the approach angle, immediately adjusting her final approach, heading to compensate. 800 meters was short for an A-10 under normal conditions, borderline under these. She'd need to be on speed and on slope and on centerline from the moment she crossed the threshold, no room for a second attempt. One shot, she was fine with one shot. She set up the approach from the south, keeping the crosswind on her left side where she was stronger, and she ran through the landing checklist in the way she ran through everything systematically, completely, without rushing the items that needed time, and without lingering on the ones that didn't. Gear down, flaps, speed. The chem lights came up beneath her twin rows of green in the dark. The crosswind hit her on final exactly as she'd expected. Not worse than predicted. Not better, just exactly the number that the recovery team had given her, which she appreciated because there was nothing like being told 25 knots and feeling 40 knots to remind you that the universe was not on your side. Tonight, the number was honest. She crossed the threshold at the right speed. She put the aircraft on the surface. The main gear hit and the nose came down, and she was on the brakes and the reversers, and the 800 meters were going past her at a rate that was fast but was manageable. And at 500 meters, she knew she had it. And at 200 meters, she was almost stopped, and at 50 meters, she was stopped. She sat in the cockpit for a moment and listened to the engines wind down. Outside, she could hear the wind. She popped the canopy. The cold hit her immediately, the real cold of the Nevada high desert in October at this hour, the kind that found the gaps in your flight suit and reminded you that the planet was indifferent to whatever you had just accomplished. The recovery team's vehicle was already pulling up alongside. A crew chief she didn't recognize was running toward her with a ladder and a look on his face that she would think about for a long time afterward. Not relief exactly, but something that had the same components rearranged in an unfamiliar order. Major Vance, he said, putting the ladder against the aircraft. Are you injured? Negative. She climbed down. Her legs felt the way legs feel after 2 hours of sustained tension, slightly unreliable, which she addressed by standing very still for 2 seconds and then deciding her legs were fine. Aircraft status. We'll do a full inspection, ma'am, but she looks clean from here. She looked at the aircraft. The Warthog sat on the dry lake bed with its characteristic ugly, beautiful solidity. The airframe that had been built to take punishment and deliver it, the G-8, poking out of the nose like it always did, the thing that made it what it was. She put one hand briefly on the fuselage. Then she took it away. Her radio crackled. Guard frequency still live. Storm 01. Nolan's voice. He was in the vehicle. She could hear road noise in the background. Danny's awake. He wanted me to tell you something. She held the radio. Go ahead. Static. Then a voice thin and exhausted and unmistakable. My son's middle name is going to be Storm. A pause. Breathing. That's not a joke. Tell her that's not a joke. She heard Nolan in the background. He's not joking. She stood on the dry lake bed in the wind and the dark, and she held the radio. And she did not respond for 3 seconds because 3 seconds was what she needed. Tell him, she said finally, that's the best news I've had tonight. She heard something in the background that might have been Webb laughing, which she would not have predicted, and which meant she thought that Danny was actually okay, because Webb did not laugh in the presence of patients who were not actually okay. Storm 01, Nolan said, we're 20 minutes from Nellis Medical Facility. Command has cleared a trauma team. Copy that. And Layla, he used her name, first time all night. Thank you. The wind pushed at her. The recovery crew was moving around the aircraft with flashlights beginning their inspection. Somewhere to the north, Bravo Command. Actual was managing a situation that was going to generate a significant amount of paperwork. Somewhere in a base operations center, Captain Hollins was still writing down everything that had happened in the order it had happened, which was going to matter. And somewhere much closer to the surface of this specific night than any of that, a woman stood on a lake bed in Nevada with the wind in her face and a radio in her hand, and she thought about a decision she had made at a coffee station in an operations center, and then she thought about the decision she had made in the cockpit, and then she thought about all the decisions between those two that had added up to 12 men alive, and one of them naming his son after her call sign. Get some rest, Chief, she said. She turned off the radio. The crew chief was standing nearby, patient waiting. Ma'am, he said, we have a vehicle to take you back to base. In a minute. She looked at the sky. The storm was still there, still moving, still doing what it did. But to the east, at the very edge of what was visible, there was the faintest suggestion of something lighter. Not dawn. Dawn was hours away, but the edge of the storm system itself, the place where it ended and the clear air beyond it began. She looked at it for a while. Then the crew chief spoke again quietly. Ma'am, there are a lot of people back at Nellis waiting to talk to you. I know. Colonel Marsh is... I know what Colonel Marsh is doing. She turned from the sky. Let's go. She walked to the vehicle. She got in. The driver pulled out and drove northeast across the dry lake bed toward the road, the headlights cutting through the dark, the storm pushing at the sides of the vehicle with the particular persistence of something that hadn't finished yet. She was not afraid of what was waiting at Nellis. She had been afraid of things before, genuinely, honestly afraid in the way that fear is useful and real and not something to argue with. She had been afraid when she entered the canyon. She had been afraid on the final approach to the lake bed. Fear was a tool she understood and worked with. What was waiting at Nellis was not something to be afraid of. It was a reckoning, and reckonings were different. They required a different posture. Not courage exactly, something quieter. The willingness to stand in front of what you chose and say, yes, I chose this. I would choose it again. She looked at her hands in her lap, still in her flight gloves. Steady. She was still steady. At Nellis Medical, 20 minutes later, a trauma team was working on Danny Reyes, who was going to live, who was in the assessment of the lead trauma surgeon, going to be absolutely fine. The blood loss significant, but the damage manageable, the tourniquet and IV work in the field buying exactly the time that had needed to be bought. He was going into surgery, but he was going into surgery with good numbers, which was a different situation than the alternative. In the waiting area, 11 men in dirty tactical gear sat in the particular exhausted stillness of people who have been operating at maximum capacity for hours and have now encountered a room where nothing immediately needs to happen. Andres Reyes was among them, not leaving, not going back to his vehicles, simply present in the way family is present when there's nothing to do but be there. Eddie Galvez sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor and thought about things he would not say out loud until he was somewhere private. Keller had fallen asleep in his chair, which was not surprising because Keller could fall asleep in a firefight if the firefight went on long enough. Carver was eating a vending machine sandwich with the focused attention of a man who has not eaten in 6 hours. And Nolan Briggs stood at the window at the end of the corridor looking out at the base, his radio in his hand, even though there was nothing to listen to because old habits are old habits, and he was thinking about a voice that had come through on the guard frequency at 2231, and what it had cost to get there and what it was going to cost the person who produced it. He was thinking about what he had said he would do. He was going to do it. Whatever happened next with Marsh and the inquiry and the papers that were already being filed somewhere in this building, whatever happened in the official version of this night, he was going to make sure someone heard the real version. All of it. Not a summary, not a report, all of it. He held the radio and he looked out the window at the base under the storm, and he made that decision the way he made all his decisions, quietly, completely, and without the intention of revisiting it. 2347, Nellis Air Force Base. The vehicle carrying Layla pulled through the main gate at Nellis 11 minutes after leaving the lake bed, and the first thing she noticed was that the base had a different quality than it had when she left. Not louder, not more active, but different in the way places get different when something has happened in them that everyone knows about and nobody is talking about yet. The driver said nothing the entire ride. She appreciated that. She used the 11 minutes to do what she always did after a mission, run the flight backward in her head, start to finish looking for the decisions she had made and evaluating them, not with the outcome in mind, but with what she had known at the moment of each one. This was how she stayed honest with herself. You could not evaluate decisions by their results because results were partly luck, and luck was not a skill. You evaluated them by the information available and the reasoning applied and whether the reasoning held up when you stripped the outcome away. The canyon entry, the eastern ridgeline engagement, the western overhang, the eastern floor, the close one, the one that had required her to work within margins that made the manual unhappy, the show of force, the orbit, the lakebed approach. She went through all of it. Every decision held. She would make them all the same way again. That was what she needed to know. Everything else was going to be whatever it was going to be. The vehicle stopped in front of the base operations building. 2 figures were waiting outside the entrance. She recognized one of them immediately because she had been in enough rooms with him to know his silhouette. Bravo Command Actual turned out to be Brigadier General Thomas Carrick, who was the Deputy Commander of the Air Force Special Operations Command Liaison Element at Nellis, and who had apparently driven to the base from his off-base residence at some point in the last hour because someone had called him and told him what was happening. The second figure was Captain Hollins. He was standing slightly behind Carrick with a tablet under his arm and the expression of a man who has been awake for a very long time and has done everything he could do and is now waiting to see how the next part goes. Layla got out of the vehicle. She walked to them. She stopped and stood straight and looked at Carrick, who was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. "Major Vance," he said, "General Carrick, walk with me." They went inside Hollins, following at a respectful distance, and Carrick led her not to a conference room or a formal office, but to the small break room at the end of the operations corridor, which was empty except for a coffee machine and a table with 4 chairs and the particular institutional fluorescent light that made everyone look like they hadn't slept in a week, which in this case was accurate. He sat down. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He was quiet for a moment, his hands folded on the table. He was in his late 50s with the economical build of a man who had stayed in shape out of habit rather than vanity, and the face of someone who had been making difficult decisions for long enough that the difficulty no longer showed on the surface. What showed instead was a kind of settled attention, a way of being fully present in a room that she associated with people who had learned that presence was the first requirement of command. "I spoke to Nolan Briggs 20 minutes ago," he said. "He gave me a full account of the night. Detailed. He was very specific about the sequence of events and about what each person did and when." "Yes, sir." "He was also specific about what did not happen. The extraction request, the response from this command, the timeline." He paused. "Captain Hollins's log corroborates all of it." She looked at Hollins briefly. He met her eyes. He looked exhausted and composed and entirely certain that he had done the right thing, which was its own kind of answer to everything. "Colonel Marsh has filed his complaint." Carrick continued. That is his right, and I will not interfere with the administrative process. He stopped. Then, but I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Yes, sir. At any point tonight, did you believe that Bravo 7 could have been saved by any means other than what you did? She thought about it. She genuinely thought about it because the question deserved an honest answer and not a reflexive one. No, sir, she said. No other aircraft was in range or willing to launch. Ground access was not available without Ranger 5, who self-deployed on his own initiative. The weather window was closing. If I had waited for authorization, the window would have closed before any alternative could be organized. She paused, and Danny Reyes would have died before the window reopened. Carrick nodded slowly. He looked at the table. Marsh would tell you that's speculation, he said. Marsh wasn't in that canyon, sir. A silence. Then Carrick said something that she had not expected. No, he wasn't. He stood up. She stood up. He looked at her for a moment with that same settled attention. The inquiry will proceed through normal channels, he said. I want you to cooperate fully. I want every decision documented in your own words, all of it. A pause. I also want you to know that I intend to be at that inquiry, personally. She understood what that meant. She did not say so because some things were better acknowledged without words. Yes, sir, she said. He started to leave. Then he stopped. Captain Hollins tells me the hydraulic sensor cleared at 1908, he said, not turning around, and that he filed the maintenance clearance at 2205. That is correct, sir. So technically you were not flying a grounded aircraft. Technically, no, sir. He was quiet for another second. Marsh is going to argue intent. I expect so, sir. What will you say? She considered that. I'll say that I knew the sensor had cleared and that I made a judgment that the aircraft was airworthy, which is accurate. And the unauthorized launch, I'll say that I made the decision that the situation required immediate action and that I was the most qualified available asset and that I accept full responsibility for that decision. He nodded. Once. Good night, Major, he said and walked out. Hollins lingered. He waited until Carrick's footsteps had faded down the corridor, and then he looked at her with the direct gaze of someone who has spent a night watching things happen and has finished deciding what he thinks about them. You knew I'd filed the clearance, he said. Not a question. I didn't know, she said, but I thought you might, the way you looked at me when I was at the coffee station. He was quiet. I looked at the sensor log at 2202 after the guard frequency came in. The sensor had been clear for 3 hours. He paused. It seemed like information that should be in the record. Thank you, Captain. He shook his head short and firm. Don't thank me. I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was accurate. He picked up his tablet. The record should be accurate, that's all. She looked at him. He was 29 years old and had spent the night writing down the truth as precisely as he could in a building where the senior officer was choosing not to act. And he had done it because the record should be accurate, and she thought that this was the kind of person who ended up mattering in ways that nobody predicted. You're going to be fine, Captain, she said. He almost smiled. So, are you Major? He walked out. She stood alone in the break room under the fluorescent light, and she was, for the first time since she had walked toward the flight line, alone in the actual sense. No radio, no aircraft, no mission, no immediate next decision required. Just a room and a coffee machine and the particular silence of the end of a thing. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She sat down. She drank it. 0023, Nellis Medical. Danny Reyes came out of surgery at 023, and the surgeon met Andres in the corridor and said the words that surgeons say when things went the way they're supposed to go: stable, successful recovery timeline. And Andres listened to all of them and then sat down on the bench in the corridor and put his hands over his face and stayed that way for approximately 45 seconds, which was 45 seconds of doing something private in a public place that every man in that corridor understood and gave him room for. Nolan was the one who sat down next to him. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, which was the right thing because some moments didn't need language, and adding language to them was a kind of theft. After the 45 seconds, Andres took his hands down. His face was composed again, or was working on it. My brother is an idiot for joining the Navy, he said. He's a good operator, Nolan said. He's an idiot. He could have gone guard like me. A pause. At least guard commanders listen to the guard frequency. Nolan looked at him. Andres looked back. There was something in his face that was complicated in the way family was always complicated when one member of it had just come very close to a thing that you couldn't reverse. I was 12 miles away, he said quietly. 12 miles, if I hadn't had the radio on. But you did. 12 miles, he repeated like the number had a weight to it. Stop doing that math, Nolan said. It doesn't go anywhere useful. He leaned back against the wall. The math that matters is this: your brother is out of surgery. Your trucks were at the canyon exit in time. Your driver got us here in 18 minutes on a dirt road in a storm. He looked at Andres. That math goes somewhere. Andres was quiet. Then, who is she, the pilot? Major Layla Vance, a 10. She's been here at Nellis for... Nolan stopped. Actually, I don't know how long she's been here. I've never met her. She launched alone, against orders. Yes. For 12 men she'd never met. Yes. Andres processed that. What happens to her now? Nolan had been thinking about that since he got off the radio on the way in. He'd been thinking about it through the debrief with Carrick, who had been precise and thorough and had not tipped his hand except in the small ways that people with his level of experience sometimes did when they wanted you to understand something without saying it directly. He'd been thinking about it while Webb went in to check on Danny post-surgery, and while Keller continued sleeping in his chair, and while Carver finished his sandwich and started on a second one. I don't know, he said, which was honest. Marsh is going to push hard. He filed the complaint fast, which means he's been planning it since the moment she launched. And Carrick is going to the inquiry, in person. Andres thought about that. That's significant. It is. But it might not be enough. Nolan looked at the quarter. No, it might not be enough on its own. He paused, which is why it's not going to be just Carrick. He pulled out his phone. He had 14 missed calls. He had been ignoring them since they arrived because he had not yet had 2 consecutive minutes that belonged to him and not to the mission. Now he looked at the numbers. 3 of them he didn't recognize. 4 were from the team's administrative chain. 2 were from a number he recognized as a Washington area code and a name that carried weight in the particular ecosystem where military decisions got made above the operational level. He looked at those 2 for a moment. Then he opened his contacts and found a different number. A journalist. Not a sensationalist, not someone chasing noise, but someone he had given a story to once 2 years ago about a training program that was quietly destroying young operators and who had gotten it right. Had gotten all of it right, every detail, every context, the whole thing, and had let him review it before it ran. He trusted that person. He trusted them the way you trusted people you had tested. He sent a text. 4 words. Tonight. Can we talk? The response came back in 90 seconds. Yes, whenever you're ready. He put the phone in his pocket. What are you doing? Eddie asked. He had materialized from somewhere down the corridor with 2 cups of bad vending machine coffee, which he distributed without ceremony. Starting the other fight, Nolan said. Eddie handed him the coffee. You think the public version matters here? I think the public version is the only thing that gives the official version a reason to come out right. He took the coffee. Marsh filed a complaint that's going to go into a process that's designed to be invisible. The inquiry will be internal. The findings will be classified or buried or both. And 6 months from now, Layla Vance's career will be over, and the record will say she violated protocol, and the reason she violated it will be in a footnote. Eddie was quiet. Unless, Nolan continued, the part where she saved 12 lives is already public. Unless the sequence of events is already on record somewhere that Marsh can't touch. Unless people who were not in that operations center already know what happened in that operations center. Eddie drank his coffee. You're going to talk to a reporter. Yes. Tonight. Yes. Chief, Eddie's voice had the quality it had when he was choosing his words carefully, which was different from when he just chose them precisely. If you do this, if this becomes a public thing, it doesn't just affect her. It affects the command. It affects our missions. The administration of this base will have, I know, and Marsh has friends. I know. And you could be making things worse for her, not better. If she's perceived as the center of a political... I talked to Carrick, Nolan said. I didn't ask him directly, but I told him what I was thinking about doing, and I described it clearly enough that if he'd wanted to stop me, he would have said something. Eddie went still. He didn't say anything. He said goodnight. A pause. Okay, Eddie said, just that. The same two words Nolan had said on the radio to Layla, carrying the same weight. Okay. Nolan looked at his phone. I'm going to step outside for 20 minutes. I'll be here. He walked down the corridor and out through the side exit into the cold night air. And he stood for a moment just breathing because it was the first time in hours that he had been outside without a mission requirement attached to it. The air was cold and the storm was still overhead, but the worst of it had moved east, the wind dropping a little, the quality of the sky shifting in a way that wasn't yet clearing but was the beginning of the process. He made the call. The journalist answered on the second ring. Nolan, she said. Her name was Sarah Michaels, and she was 42 and had spent 15 years covering military affairs, and she had the specific alert quality in her voice, even at midnight, of someone who had trained themselves to be ready at any hour, because the hours that mattered didn't arrive on schedule. Are you all right? I'm fine. My team is fine. One man in surgery going to make it. What happened? Tonight in Ashford Canyon, he stopped. He thought about how to begin. He'd given hundreds of debriefs in his career, operational summaries, after action reports, the formal language of what happened and when and why. This was different. This was the version where the formal language wasn't enough. There's a pilot, he said. I need you to understand who she is before I tell you what she did. Sarah was quiet. She was listening. Her name is Layla Vance, he said, and she's about to get court-martialed for saving my team's lives. And I need you to know everything. From the beginning. He started talking. 01:15, Layla's quarters. She had been given 90 minutes before the preliminary inquiry briefing, which was being convened at 02:45, because the Air Force did not stop having bureaucratic processes just because it was the middle of the night, and someone had decided that the fastest way to control the narrative of this evening was to get the formal process started before the informal version had time to move. She was in her quarters. She had showered. She had changed into fresh utilities. She had eaten half a protein bar and drunk a full bottle of water and done the basic maintenance of a person who understood that physical function was a prerequisite for everything else. She was sitting at her desk with the photograph on the wall in front of her. The Army Rangers, the canyon, somewhere behind them, the note at the bottom. She had looked at it a lot over the 3 years it had been there. She had looked at it when she was tired and when she was frustrated, and when the institutional weight of a career in the military pressed down in the particular way that made you wonder whether it was worth it. She had looked at it and thought, yes, that's why. That right there. She was looking at it now. There was a knock at her door. She opened it. Standing in the corridor was a woman she had met once briefly at a flight symposium in San Antonio. Lieutenant Colonel Dana Reese, an A-10 pilot, who had left the cockpit 5 years ago for a legal affairs position, which made her the Judge Advocate General's office and specifically the officer assigned to advise pilots in disciplinary proceedings. She was holding 2 cups of coffee and had the expression of someone who had driven to this building at 1 a.m. because something had told her to. Major Vance, she said, I've been assigned as your JAG advisor for the preliminary inquiry. Can I come in? Layla stepped back. Yes. Reese came in. She set one of the coffee cups on the desk and kept the other. She looked at the photograph. She read the note. She turned and looked at Layla with the specific assessment of someone who processes people professionally and does it quickly. I've read Hollins's log, she said. I've spoken to Carrick. I've reviewed the maintenance records. A pause. I also pulled your flight record. Full 9 years. And I'm going to be completely honest with you about what tonight looks like on paper, because that's more useful to you than the version where I tell you it's all going to be fine. She sat down in the only other chair in the room. On paper, you launched an aircraft without authorization against a direct order from a superior officer. That is the core of what Marsh is filing. The unauthorized launch is the charge that has teeth. I know. The hydraulic sensor clearance filed by Hollins removes the grounded aircraft charge. That's significant. It narrows what they can pursue. She held her coffee. But the unauthorized launch is real. The conversation is in the log. Marsh told you to stand down. You launched. Yes. And 12 men are alive because of it. Reese said it flatly as a fact, not as a defense. The problem is that the military justice system is not designed to weigh outcomes against orders. It is designed to evaluate whether the order was lawfully given and whether you complied, and that evaluation does not go your way. Layla looked at her. Then what are you telling me? I'm telling you what the paper version looks like. Because the paper version is not the only version, and the other version is moving fast. Reese paused. I got a call 30 minutes ago from a contact in the JAG network. Someone leaked Hollins's log, not all of its specific sections. The sequence of events at the operations center, the guard frequency transmission, the timeline of Marsh's decision not to act. Layla went still. Who leaked it? I don't know, but it's moving. Reese met her eyes. By morning, the outline of tonight will be in at least 2 newsrooms. By midday, it will be in more. She paused. How do you feel about that? Layla thought about it honestly. It depends on whether it's accurate. From what I've seen of the log, it is. Then she stopped. She thought about Nolan Briggs standing at a window in the medical corridor with a radio in his hand making a decision. She thought about what he had said on the guard frequency before she landed. She thought about 12 men who had done the math and kept working anyway. Then it should be out there, she said. Reese nodded slowly. Marsh is going to argue that the public disclosure compromises the proceedings. Marsh is going to argue whatever Marsh argues. That's separate from whether the information is accurate. Agreed. Reese set down her coffee. Here's what I need from you before the inquiry at 0245. I need a complete written account of every decision you made from the moment you left the standby lounge to the moment you got into the recovery vehicle at the lake bed. Every decision, the reasoning, what you knew, what you didn't know. The exact order. She paused. Not a summary, the actual version. Layla looked at her desk. She looked at the photograph. I'll need a pad of paper, she said. Reese pulled one from somewhere in her jacket. She was, Layla thought, an exceptionally prepared person. Start from the coffee station, Reese said. Layla picked up the pen. She started from the coffee station. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping, the pen moving across the paper in the specific, focused way that happens when you know exactly what happened and you're simply recording it rather than constructing it. The facts were clean. The sequence was clean. The reasoning at each decision point was clear to her because she had already gone through it once in the vehicle on the way back and found that it held. She wrote it all down. At 2:15, she handed the pad to Reese, who read it without speaking, turning pages steadily, her face neutral. When she finished, she looked up. This is very clear, she said. It was a clear situation. Marsh won't see it that way. No, but clarity doesn't depend on whether Marsh sees it. Layla stood up. What do I need to know for the inquiry? Answer every question directly. Don't volunteer information beyond what's asked, but don't withhold anything. If you're asked whether you understood that you were disobeying a direct order, you say yes. If you're asked whether you would do it again, Reese stopped. I say yes, Layla said. Reese looked at her. That answer will complicate the mitigation argument. I know. The mitigation argument is the one that keeps your career. I know that too. A silence. Major Vance, Reese said carefully, I'm trying to help you keep your wings. I know you are, and I appreciate it. Layla looked at the photograph one more time. The Rangers, the canyon, the note. But if the answer to whether I do it again is yes, then that's the answer. I'm not going to give a different answer to protect my career. That's not the kind of pilot I am. Reese was quiet for a long moment. Then very slightly, she smiled. It was a small smile, controlled the smile of a person who has seen a lot of things in legal proceedings and has just seen something that doesn't fit the usual categories. All right, she said. She stood. Then we go in with the truth and we see what the truth does. That's all we've got anyway, Layla said. In my experience, Reese said, picking up her pad, it's more than you'd think. They walked out of the room together into the corridor toward the building where the preliminary inquiry was about to begin, and the night was still going, the storm still moving east, the clock on the wall, at the end of the corridor reading 2:23, and somewhere in a hospital room, a man named Daniel Reyes was sleeping off surgery, and somewhere in a waiting area, his brother was still there. And somewhere outside this building, a reporter named Sarah Michaels was writing the first draft of a story about a woman who had launched into a storm, and somewhere in an administrative office, Colonel Raymond Marsh was reviewing his complaint and making sure every line was tight. And Layla Vance walked toward the inquiry room with her written account in Reese's hands, and the answer to the hardest question already decided and nothing left to do but say it out loud. Her hands were steady. They were still steady. 0245. Conference Room B, Nellis Air Force Base. The preliminary inquiry room was not dramatic. It was a room like most rooms in most military buildings, rectangular, fluorescent, a table that had seen better decades, chairs that were functional without being comfortable. 3 officers sat on one side of the table. Layla sat on the other with Reese beside her. Colonel Marsh sat at the far end, not presiding. He was the complainant, not the adjudicator, but present, which was his right, and which he exercised with the careful stillness of a man who had decided that stillness was his strongest posture. The presiding officer was Colonel Sandra Worth, whom Layla knew by reputation and not by personal acquaintance. Worth was 53, a former F-16 pilot, and had the specific quality of a person who had spent many years in rooms where people were trying to make things complicated and had developed a finely calibrated intolerance for unnecessary complication. She had read Hollins's log. She had read the maintenance records. She had Layla's written account in front of her in a manila folder that she had not yet opened. She opened it now. She read for 4 minutes without speaking. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when everyone is waiting and nobody wants to be the first to break it. Marsh was still. The 2 other adjudicating officers, a lieutenant colonel from legal affairs and a major from the operations command, were watching Worth read. Reese had her hands folded on the table. She had told Layla on the walk over, "Let me do the procedural work. When they ask you, directly answer directly. Don't fill silences that aren't yours to fill." Layla did not fill them. Worth finished reading. She closed the folder. She looked at Layla. "Major Vance," she said, "I'm going to ask you a series of questions and I need complete answers. Not summaries, complete answers." "Yes, ma'am." "At 22:19 you started your engines. At that point, had you received authorization to launch?" "No, ma'am." "Had you received authorization to conduct a pre-flight?" "No, ma'am. I conducted the pre-flight on my own determination." "And Colonel Marsh explicitly ordered you to stand down prior to your launch?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you launched anyway?" "Yes, ma'am." Worth made a note. "Why was?" Layla had answered this question in her written account. She answered it the same way now, not because she had rehearsed it, but because the answer was the same regardless of how many times it was asked. Because Bravo 7 had 1 urgent surgical casualty who would die without intervention in under 15 minutes. Because I had direct operational knowledge of the Ashford Canyon terrain that no other available pilot possessed. Because the weather window was closing at a rate that made any delay equivalent to no response at all. And because I had determined that my aircraft was airworthy based on the sensor clearance at 1908, she paused. I made a judgment that the situation required immediate action and that I was the most capable available asset to provide it. I accept full responsibility for that judgment. Worth wrote again. Marsh shifted slightly in his chair. It was the first movement he'd made. "Colonel Marsh," Worth said without looking up, "you'll have your opportunity to address the record in approximately 10 minutes. Marsh went still again. "Major Vance," Worth continued, "you stated that you determined your aircraft was airworthy based on the sensor clearance at 1908. Were you aware at the time of launch that Captain Hollins had filed the formal maintenance clearance?" Layla thought carefully. "I was not certain of it, but I believed it was possible based on a statement Captain Hollins made to me earlier in the evening." "What statement?" "He told me that the maintenance log showed the sensor had cleared at 1908. I interpreted that as him having reviewed the log carefully, which suggested he understood the significance of the timeline." Worth looked at her for a moment. "You inferred that he might file the clearance." "I thought it was possible that a thorough officer who understood what was happening would ensure the record was accurate." "Yes, ma'am." A silence. The legal affairs lieutenant colonel, whose name was Bowman, said, "You're describing a decision chain that involved multiple people acting on their own initiative simultaneously. The captain filing the clearance, the guard convoy self-deploying, you launching. None of these were coordinated." "No, sir, they weren't coordinated. They were independent decisions by people who looked at the same situation and reached the same conclusion, which was that doing nothing was not acceptable." Bowman wrote something. His expression was neutral in the way that experienced legal officers' expressions were always neutral, which told her nothing about what he actually thought and everything about how long he'd been doing the job. Marsh spoke for the first time. His voice was controlled and carried the specific weight of someone who had been waiting to use it. "Colonel Worth," he said, "I want the record to reflect that what Major Vance is describing is a systematic disregard for the command structure that underpins every operational decision made by this installation. The outcome tonight, while fortunate, cannot and should not be used to retroactively justify a launch that violated direct orders, endangered Air Force assets, and undermined the authority of a senior officer. He paused. If we allow outcome to determine the validity of decisions, we have no command structure. We have 12 people all deciding individually what constitutes an acceptable risk. That is not an Air Force. That is a collection of individuals. The room was quiet. Layla looked at him. She had promised Reese she would not fill silences that weren't hers, but Wyeth turned to her and said, "Major Vance, your response." She was ready. "Colonel Marsh is correct that outcome cannot retroactively justify a decision," she said. "I agree with that principle. So I want to be precise about what I am not arguing. I am not arguing that I was right because the team survived. I am arguing that I was right because at the moment I launched the information I had and the reasoning I applied justified the decision. The outcome is evidence that the reasoning was sound. It is not the justification itself." She kept her voice level. "What I would also put in the record is this. The command structure Colonel Marsh is defending made a decision at 2147 to abandon 12 personnel in a compromised position. That decision was made by the command structure functioning exactly as designed, with a senior officer exercising his authority. The command structure worked correctly and produced an outcome that would have resulted in at least one death and possibly more." She stopped. "I did not violate the command structure because I disagreed with it. I acted outside it because the time required to work within it exceeded the time available to save a life. Those are different things. The silence after that was different from the previous silences. It had more in it." Marsh said that reasoning justifies any pilot making any unauthorized decision at any time she personally determines the situation warrants it. "No, sir. It justifies this decision in this situation with this information at this time. Generalizing it is a separate argument that I'm not making." Worth held up one hand, not dramatically, just practically the gesture of someone managing traffic. "We're going to take a 5-minute recess." She stood. Everyone stood. 0300. The corridor outside conference room B. Reese pulled Layla to the far end of the corridor and spoke quietly and fast. "You're doing well," she said. "Worth is listening. I don't know which way she goes, but she's listening. Marsh isn't going to drop it. No, he's going to push hard on the command structure argument, and he's going to cite precedent, and he's going to make the case that the outcome is irrelevant, which is procedurally correct." Reese paused. "But something is happening that is going to affect this inquiry, and I need you to know about it." Layla looked at her. "My phone has been active since we sat down," Reese said. "I've been keeping it face down, but I checked it during the recess. Sarah Michaels published a piece 11 minutes ago. It's already been picked up by 2 wire services." She paused. "It's accurate, it's detailed, and it names Marsh specifically in the context of the 2147 decision." Layla was still. "Nolan," she said, "almost certainly." She thought about Nolan Briggs at the window in the medical corridor, radio in hand. She thought about what he had said. "I am going to make sure someone hears what you did tonight. All of it. Not a summary, not a report. All of it." He had meant it. "How bad is it for the inquiry?" she asked. Reese made a face that was not quite a grimace, but was in the neighborhood. "Marsh is going to argue that the publication prejudices the proceedings. He'd be correct procedurally. Wirth might agree." She paused. "But here's the thing, the story is already out. Wirth can postpone the inquiry, but she cannot unpublish the story. And the longer this drags out, the more the public version becomes the definitive version. Which helps me. Which may help you. It also may make certain people in Washington very interested in the outcome of this inquiry, which cuts both ways." Reese looked at her steadily. "Are you comfortable with this being a public thing? Because if Nolan Briggs just made this national news, your face is going to be on the morning shows by 6 a.m. Layla thought about it for 2 seconds, not longer. "What he did is accurate," she said. "The story is accurate. I'm not going to wish it wasn't told because it's inconvenient for my legal position." Reese nodded once decisive. "All right, then we go back in and we finish the inquiry and we see what Wirth does." They walked back. 0302. The inquiry resumed. Worth reconvened the room with the same brisk efficiency she'd opened it with. She looked around the table. She looked at Marsh. Colonel Marsh, she said, I'm going to give you the floor. Marsh laid out his case methodically. He was good at it, organized, precise, without emotional excess, which was probably his most effective quality in a room like this. He cited regulations. He cited precedent. He described the operational situation as he had understood it at 2147, the weather data, the aircraft availability, assessment, the risk calculation. He was careful to stay on process and off outcome, which was strategically correct and which demonstrated that he had thought about this carefully and had correctly identified the strongest ground he had. When he finished, he was quiet. Worth said, Colonel Marsh, at 2147, when you made the determination that extraction was not possible, were you aware of Major Vance's knowledge of the Ashford Canyon terrain? A pause. I was aware she was on technical standby. That's not what I asked. Another pause. I was not specifically aware of her terrain familiarity, no. Were you aware that she had flown Ashford Canyon on a low-altitude training run approximately 3 years ago? I was not. Had you consulted the standby roster to determine whether any available pilot had operational knowledge of the specific terrain before making your determination? The pause was longer this time. The weather assessment made the terrain familiarity question secondary to the question of whether flight was possible at all, Marsh said. So that's a no. That is, I did not consult the roster specifically for terrain familiarity, correct? Worth made a note. She made it slowly, which meant she was letting the silence sit, which meant she wanted everyone in the room to understand the weight of what had just been said. Major Vance landed an A-10 on an unimproved dry lake bed in a storm after neutralizing multiple enemy positions in a canyon you assessed as unflyable, Worth said, still looking at her notepad. In your assessment, Colonel Marsh, not the policy assessment, your personal assessment was the canyon unflyable. Marsh said, the weather data indicated your personal assessment. A very long pause. Major Vance's flight record suggests she was capable of flying conditions that exceed standard operational parameters, he said. It was not an answer to the question, and everyone in the room knew it was not an answer to the question, and Worth let that stand in the air without pointing to it because she didn't need to. Thank you, Colonel, she said. She turned to the full table. I'm going to close this preliminary session and submit my findings within 48 hours. I want the record to reflect the following items have been entered: Captain Hollins's operational log, the maintenance records showing sensor clearance in 1908, informal clearance filing at 2205, Major Vance's written personal account, and the guard frequency transmission recording from 2203. She closed her own folder. We're adjourned. People stood. Chairs moved. Marsh was the first one out of the room, which told Layla something about his confidence in how the preliminary session had gone, or rather about his awareness of how it had gone versus how he had needed it to go. Reese touched Layla's arm. Come on, she said quietly. Let's get you out of here before the corridor fills up. They went out the side exit. 0331. Outside. The storm had passed. She knew it the moment she stepped outside because the quality of the air was different, cleaner, colder, with that specific stillness that comes after sustained wind finally stops. The sky to the east was still dark, but it had changed character. The clouds broken, now stars visible through the gaps. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. 14 new notifications. She put it in her pocket. Reese stood beside her. Go get some sleep, Reese said. I mean it. The 48 hours before Worth's findings are going to be intense, and you need to be functional for them. What do you think she finds? Reese was quiet for a moment. I think she finds that you violated the unauthorized launch regulation. That's a fact, and she can't ignore it. A pause. I also think she finds mitigating circumstances significant enough to recommend against court-martial. I think she recommends an administrative action, formal reprimand, possibly a temporary flight restriction rather than criminal proceedings. And Marsh can appeal the recommendation. He probably will. Reese turned to look at her. But Layla, the story is out. Right now across the country, people are reading about tonight, about what you did, about what Marsh didn't do, about Danny Reyes, about Andres Reyes on Route 318. She paused. That changes the pressure on every step of the process from here. Not because public opinion runs the Air Force, but because people in Washington are going to be reading the same story, and people in Washington care about the version of things that the country believes. Layla looked at the sky. The stars were coming back one by one, finding their places again after the storm. I didn't do it for the story, she said. I know you didn't. That's partly why it's a good story. She looked at her phone again. There was a text from a number she didn't have saved. She opened it. It read Storm 01 from This is Nolan. I talked to a journalist tonight. The full account. I told her you didn't know I was going to do it, and you didn't ask me to. She knows that. The story reflects it. I made a decision the same way you made one. I hope it helps. Either way, I'd make it again. Briggs. She read it twice. She typed back, copy that, Vance. She put the phone in her pocket. Reese had already started walking back toward the building. Layla stayed outside for another minute alone in the cold, in the clear that had come after the storm, and she breathed the air that tasted like it had been washed clean, and she let herself feel the full weight of the night for the first time without a mission requirement attached to it. It was heavy. The weight of it was real, and she did not try to minimize it or manage it or redirect it. She just held it for the minute that it took her to hold it, and then she exhaled slowly and completely, the way you exhale when you have been holding something that needed to be held and can now carefully set it down. She walked back inside. 0714, Nellis Medical. Danny Reyes woke up at 7:14 in the morning in a hospital room that had more people in it than hospital rooms usually did. Marcus Webb was there asleep in the chair in the corner in a way that suggested he had not intended to fall asleep, and had done so anyway because Webb had been running on nothing for 6 hours and bodies eventually made their own decisions. Andres was there awake, sitting beside the bed with the stillness of someone who had been there all night and was not planning to leave. And Nolan Briggs was there standing at the window, which was where Andres had told him he'd been standing half the night, looking at the same view. Danny opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling and said, "Am I alive?" "Yes," Andres said. "Is my leg still attached?" "Yes." "Is my baby still happening?" "Your wife called at 6 a.m. She is very much still pregnant, and she is currently on a flight from Virginia Beach, and she is going to arrive at approximately 10 o'clock, and she is extremely angry with you." Danny processed this information. Good angry or bad angry? The kind where she's been crying and trying to hide it. So somewhere in between. Danny closed his eyes again. Then he opened them. "Storm 01, say," he said. "You okay?" Nolan turned from the window. "She's in an inquiry. She's going to be fine." "You sure?" "No, but I'm working on it." He walked closer to the bed. He looked at Danny the way you look at someone you almost lost and are now recalibrating to having kept. "How do you feel?" "Like someone put a tourniquet on my leg in the dark in the desert while people were shooting at us." Webb's going to be very proud of that assessment. Tell him when he wakes up. Danny looked at the ceiling again. "Chief, what do we do for her?" "We already started." "What else can we do?" Nolan looked at the window. He had been thinking about this since 3 a.m. since he finished the call with Sarah Michaels and came back inside and sat in the waiting area and ran through everything that was in motion and everything that still could move. The story was published. Carrick was involved. Reese was good. Worth was careful and fair. The inquiry was in process. But Marsh was not going to stop. Marsh had too much invested in the version of tonight where he was correct and she was insubordinate. And Marsh had procedural tools available to him that could outlast public attention and outlast Carrick's involvement if the process dragged long enough. There was one thing that could change that calculation more than anything else. Not the story, not the inquiry, testimony. Not a log, not a report, not a written account. 12 men who were alive because of a decision standing in a room and saying so with their names and their ranks attached. "What else can we do?" Danny had asked. "We show up," Nolan said. "When the inquiry reconvenes, when Worth takes statements, when there's a room where the official version is being decided." He looked at Danny. "All of us, every man from Bravo 7 who can stand up gives a statement. On the record, under oath. What we saw, what command did, what she did, the exact sequence." Danny looked at him. "You think Worth takes that into account?" "I think Worth is a pilot and a 20-year officer, and she has already heard enough tonight to know what this is. I think 12 testimonies makes it impossible for any step above Worth to quietly bury the findings." He paused. And I think when Marsh's appeal lands on someone's desk in Washington and it has 12 signed statements attached to it, the political calculus changes. Webb made a sound from the corner chair. He was not entirely asleep. "I'm in," he said without opening his eyes. Andre said, "I'll file a separate statement as the convoy commander on the Nevada Guard letterhead." The room was quiet for a moment in the way rooms are quiet when something has been decided and everyone in them knows it. Danny said, "My wife's going to want to thank her." "Let's get you through surgery recovery before we plan any thanking," Nolan said. "She's going to do it whether we plan it or not. You don't know my wife." Danny paused. "She's very determined." "It runs in the family," Andre said in Darsa. 0947. The story had moved faster than anyone had predicted. By 6 a.m., the original piece had been picked up by the wire services. By 7, it was the lead item on 3 national news sites. By 8, 2 senators had made statements, one calling for a full investigation into the command decision at 2147, one calling for recognition of the personnel involved. By 9, Sarah Michaels had published a follow-up with additional detail from sources she didn't name, but who were clearly multiple and clearly had direct knowledge of the inquiry proceedings. Layla was in her quarters sleeping, which Reese had ordered her to do when her phone started ringing at 9:15 with a number she recognized as belonging to the office of the Secretary of the Air Force. She let it go to voicemail because she was asleep, and because Reese had said to sleep, and because she had made a decision somewhere around 4 a.m. that she was going to trust the process and the people in it and stop trying to manage things she couldn't control. She listened to the voicemail at 9:47. It was not the secretary. It was an aide requesting that she be available for a call at 11 a.m. The tone was not hostile. It was careful. She called Reese. "I know," Reese said before Layla could speak. "I got the same call as 15 minutes ago. This is above Marsh now, above Carrick. The office of the secretary is involved." A pause. "Layla, I don't want to tell you this is good news because I don't know what it is yet, but it is not the same situation it was at 2:45 this morning." "What changed?" 12 testimonies were filed with the inquiry at 0830. Bravo 7 every man, plus a statement from Captain Andres Reyes as convoy commander. Reese paused, and Worth moved her findings from 48 hours to this afternoon. "She's not waiting." Layla sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the photograph on the wall. "Nolan," she said. "He moved fast." She thought about a man who had been doing math all night and had kept choosing to keep working anyway. She thought about 12 men who had been left behind and who were right now lining up to make sure the person who came back for them was not buried in a process that moved too slowly for truth to win. She thought about Eddie Galvez saying in the background of a radio transmission, "She knows what she's doing." "What do I do between now and 11?" she asked. "Eat something," Reese said. "Drink water. Do not talk to any journalists. Do not make any statements. And trust that the right people have the right information." She hung up. She looked at the photograph. She ate half a sandwich from the small refrigerator in her quarters, which was not enough but was what was there, and she drank a full bottle of water, and she sat at her desk, and she did not try to run the scenarios forward, because the scenarios were out of her hands now, and she understood that. The decision she had made on the tarmac had started a chain of decisions made by other people. Hollins, Nolan Worth, Carrick, and Andres Reyes on Route 3, 1812 men in a waiting area, filing statements, and that chain was moving. The way chains moved, gathering momentum, going somewhere she could see the direction of, but not the end. She had done her part. The rest was going to be what it was going to be. At 11 a.m. she took the call. Time 11 o'clock. The call. It lasted 22 minutes. She was not going to describe the content of it to anyone who wasn't already in the process because Reese had told her not to, and Reese was right. What she could say and what she said to Reese immediately afterward was that the voice on the other end of the call had been precise and direct and had asked her the same questions Worth had asked in roughly the same order and had listened to the same answers without interruption. At the end of the 22 minutes, the voice had said, "Major Vance, I want you to know that a full review of the command decisions made at 2147 is being initiated separately from your inquiry. That review is not contingent on the outcome of your proceedings and will move on its own timeline." She had said, "Yes, sir. I also want you to know that the findings of your preliminary inquiry are being reviewed at this level before any further action is taken." "Yes, sir." A pause. You've read your written account to me accurately. You've answered every question I've asked the same way you answered them at 2:45 this morning. That consistency is noted. Another pause. Major Vance, I want to ask you the same question Colonel Worth did not ask you directly. Would you do it again? She did not hesitate. Yes, sir. The longest pause. That's what I thought, he said. We'll be in touch. The call ended. She sat with the phone in her hand for 30 seconds. Then she put it down and she breathed slowly and completely the same exhale she had done outside after the inquiry. And she thought, whatever comes next, I said the true thing every time I was asked. That was enough. That had to be enough. And somewhere underneath the uncertainty of what came next, she knew it actually was. 1433. Worth's findings. The findings came at 1433, delivered to Reese's tablet in a document that Reese read standing in Layla's quarters, while Layla sat at the desk and watched her face. Reese read for 90 seconds. She was good at keeping her face neutral. She was not quite managing. What does it say? Layla asked. Reese looked up. She set the tablet on the desk. Worth finds that you violated the unauthorized launch regulation, she said. That's in the record. It's not going away. She paused. She also finds, and I'm quoting directly, that the mitigating circumstances of this case are extraordinary in nature and degree that the decision made by Major Vance reflects a standard of operational judgment that is the hallmark of the most capable officers in the service, and that the application of punitive action would constitute a misuse of the disciplinary process in a manner inconsistent with the values this service is intended to uphold. Reese paused again. She recommends against court-martial. She recommends against administrative sanction. She recommends instead that the matter be resolved with a formal letter of counseling, non-punitive, and that the full circumstances of the evening be submitted for review in connection with the separate investigation of the 2147 command decision. The room was quiet. Layla looked at the desk. She looked at the tablet with the findings on the screen, and she thought about a room at 2:45 in the morning where she had said the true thing and had not tried to make it say anything different than it was. Marsh, she said, will appeal. Almost certainly. Reese sat down, but the appeal goes up the chain at a time when the secretary's office is already involved. 12 testimonies are on file. The public version of events is established, and a separate command review is in progress. She met Layla's eyes. The appeal can go wherever it goes. The ground it has to cover is different than it was last night. It's not over, Layla said. No, but the direction changed. Reese paused. And you still have your wings. Layla looked at the photograph. The Rangers in the canyon, the note, you came when nobody else would. That's all there is. She thought about Danny Reyes in a hospital room saying his son's middle name was going to be Storm, and meaning it. She thought about Andres on Route 3 when 3 vehicles, 18 personnel, listening to a guard frequency because something had told him to. She thought about Hollins at his station writing down everything that happened in the order it happened because the record should be accurate, because that was all, because that was enough. She thought about 12 men in a canyon who had done the math and kept working, because what else do you do, and about a voice on a radio that had said, continue to evade, and the silence that had followed, and the decision that had been made in that silence by a woman at a coffee station who had heard the most unacceptable sound of her life and decided she was not going to let it be the last sound. She looked at her hands. Steady, still steady. Okay, she said. She stood up. She looked at Reese, who had given her the truth at every step and who had walked with her into a room at 2:45 in the morning and stood beside her while she said the only thing she had to say. Thank you, Layla said. Reese shook her head. You did that yourself. I had help. Everyone who does something real has help. Reese stood. That's different from not having done it yourself. 3 weeks later, Danny Reyes was discharged from Nellis Medical on a Thursday morning, which was 16 days after his surgery and 4 days ahead of the revised projection. Webb said it was because Reyes had the constitution of someone too stubborn to follow a recovery timeline which was accurate. His wife Elena, who had landed at 10 a.m. on the morning after the canyon and had been at the hospital every day since, was there when he walked out. She was 8 months pregnant, and she walked beside him without touching him because he had told her he wanted to walk out on his own, And she had respected that while also staying close enough to catch him if he needed it, which was his own definition of the right kind of support. Nolan Briggs was there. So was Eddie. Webb had driven from the base. Keller was there. Torres. Carver, who brought a sandwich for himself and apparently forgot that other people might also want one, which was so characteristically Carver that several men who had spent 3 weeks processing the weight of what had happened found themselves laughing for the first time since the canyon, and the laughter was real and it was the right thing for the moment. Layla Vance was not there. She was in the air. She had been cleared to fly 4 days after Worth's findings while the appeal moved through its process above her, with a momentum that was slowing by the week as the separate command review expanded and the political weight above it shifted in the direction that political weight shifted when the public version of something was established and accurate and not going away. She was in the air because that was where she belonged, and she knew it, and the Air Force knew it, and even Marsh, somewhere above the process in the place where people eventually ran out of ground to stand on, was beginning to understand it. She was in the A-10, and she was over the Nevada desert on a training flight, and the sky was clear, and the air was cold, and the aircraft responded the way it always did, honest and direct, and without pretense the way she liked things to be. She was not over Ashford Canyon. That route was not on her training schedule, and she did not seek it out. There was no reason to go back to it. What had happened there had happened, and it was finished, and the canyon was just a canyon, the same as it had always been before one night in October made it something else. What she thought about at altitude over the desert was simpler than the canyon. Simpler than the inquiry and the findings and the appeal in the Secretary's office and the separate command review that was currently producing findings that Colonel Raymond Marsh was not going to enjoy. Simpler than all of it. She thought about this guard frequency, the voice of a man who had run out of options and had put the truth on the open air and trusted that someone was listening. She thought about the fact that she had been in a building with bad coffee for a reason that was luck and circumstance and the particular random arrangement of an October evening, and that she had been the person who heard it. She thought about what Reese had said that's different from not having done it yourself. She held the aircraft straight and level. The desert spread out below her in every direction, vast and indifferent and beautiful in the way that very large things are beautiful, the way the earth is beautiful from altitude when you can see how much of it there is and how briefly you pass through it. She did not think about whether it was worth it. She had done it and she would do it again, and that was the answer to the worth question and always had been. She thought instead about a boy who was going to be born in approximately 1 month in a hospital in Virginia Beach to a woman named Elena who had walked beside her husband without touching him on a Thursday morning because she understood what he needed, which was his own form of courage, the quieter kind. The boy's middle name was going to be Storm. That name was going to mean something to him for his entire life, and he was never going to know exactly how it felt to be up here in the aircraft in the dark, and the weather finding the strobe and calling out and doing the thing that needed doing. He was never going to know the feeling of the canyon walls on either side, or the turbulence hitting the airframe, or the fuel gauge running its honest arithmetic towards zero. But he was going to carry the name. And the name was going to carry the night. And the night when you stripped away the inquiry and the politics and the appeal and all the machinery that humans build to manage the consequences of what other humans do. The night was this 12 men alive who should not have been, because one person looked at the silence after the most unacceptable sound and refused to let it stand. That was the whole story. The rest was just what happened afterward. Layla Vance leveled off at 8,000 feet and turned south toward home, the desert below her, and the sky above her, and the aircraft between honest and direct going exactly where she pointed it. The way things should go. The way things sometimes against the odds and the weather and the people who stand in the way actually do.